Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this program. This is a joint conference put together by AEI, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Claremont McKenna College's Policy Lab. Today, we're going to talk about the new Community Grants Program, which replaced the old and sometimes criticized process of earmarking. The Community Grants Program was established earlier this year and aims to re-empower legislators to direct funding to projects that are desired by communities. Rather than let anonymous, unaccountable executive branch personnel decide what infrastructure or other items are worth funding, the Community Grants Program allows members of Congress, should they wish to participate, to request funding for particular projects, be they road repairs, upgrades to hospitals and health facilities, new tools for local police departments, or many other things. Now, this conference runs from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. today and features 2 panels and ample opportunity for audience participation. We look forward to hearing your questions and comments. You'll get further instructions on how to queue up your questions and comments shortly. To start us off, we're going to hear from the Honorable Tom Graves. He currently is the President and CEO of Irvin Graves Strategy Group, and he's the honorary chairman of America's Future Together. Tom Graves served in the House for a decade as a Republican representative of Georgia's 14th Congressional District. He is particularly well poised to discuss the Community Grants Program and the power of the purse. He ran as a Tea Party member, he served as an appropriator, and he co-chaired the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which, if you had not heard, recommended various strategies to strengthen Congress's power over the purse, including something that looks a bit like the Community Grants Program. With that, let's move to our keynote. Honorable Tom Graves, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and welcome to the AEI family out there and community. Thanks for tuning in for this conversation. It's really sort of exciting. I was really honored to be considered to sort of kick this off for you, because there's, what a great conversation to have about, I guess, government funding, appropriations process, and fiscal responsibility. And then the old term earmark slips up, and right before Christmas, we might as well talk about this kind of thing because it's important. It's important moving ahead. So as Kevin mentioned, I was elected just over a decade ago, and I was elected in the Tea Party movement, very fiscal conservative, fiscal responsible effort and movement. And as a state legislator ahead of that for 8 years, I had a very strong record of fiscal responsibility. But as soon as I was elected, I was put on the Appropriations Committee, and it wasn't a committee I was really seeking. Actually, it was one in which our leadership at the time, in which was incoming Speaker John Boehner and Majority Leader Eric Cantor and Kevin McCarthy and others, wanted to see fiscal conservatives move to the Appropriations Committee to begin shaping how Republicans would govern. And one of the first rules that was imposed by the Republicans at that time was to remove the old and known earmark component that was in the House rules, or in the Republican rules in the House rules. And it was an abused process. I will admit to that. And I think a lot of campaigns were lost and a lot were won based on that broken process. And so over the next decade, we all got to begin analyzing that process. And 1, was it needed? 2, was it broken? And if so, did it need to come back? And if it did, what should it look like? And how do you protect the American people and the taxpayer from the abuse that had taken place prior to that? Well, another thing actually developed during that time, and that was we saw a new abuse occur. And it was actually an abuse by the executive branch was beginning to take place, because for the first time in imagine decades and decades, Congress had given over a certain right and ability, and that was the ability to designate where funds might go. When they're closest to the people in the House of Representatives, they knew better as to where funds should be directed, but now stepping in that place because Congress had in essence tied their hands. They punished themselves and had taken this pause. The executive branch began taking that over and making their decisions and their choices. And it went through Democrat administration, then through a Republican administration for Congress to finally realize, you know what, we may not have been good at it. We may have had problems and we may have had abuses, But if we're going to correct it, we need to correct it. And we cannot hand the power of the purse over to the executive branch. We've got to have that disconnect to occur. So as chairman, as the vice chair of the Modernization Committee in my final term, I decided to take this on and join as the Republican lead, in essence, and say, as a conservative, as a movement conservative, give me a chance to draft up a framework of what I think can work. That can be the start. And that's what is exciting about this panel that's about to follow, is that they'll get to evaluate the first stab at it from Congress, as the House did it in a minimal way, sort of a beta test this year of the framework that we adopted. But I'll just summarize what we were looking at and what was really important. One, that there was true accountability, that the members were held accountable, and that there was transparency, that everybody could see what was happening and that it was limited. Now, the one thing about this new process is that it doesn't increase spending in any way. And in fact, the top line of what the government's going to spend is what it is. This just takes a piece of that and says, okay, if members of Congress receive community requests, and it has to originate and derive not from the member's office, but actually from the community, and it be a process that's more like a grant process, and that's a merit-based. You demonstrate that you have skin in the game, that you have done your homework, that everything's in place, and that local government or that state or whomever it might be, because it must be a local or state government or a nonprofit, will be held accountable ultimately. But it was a process that started to bring in limits, transparency, and accountability. So you'll hear about how the web portals are working. You'll hear about who's requesting and how many, that they're actually limited to how many requests they can do, and that the overall amount of requests that can be granted is limited to just a portion of the discretionary spending. But one of the other things that really excited me, and I'll sort of wrap it up with this, is that we have to get back to a spot in Congress where there's bipartisanship, where Republicans and Democrats are beginning to work together. And only they know in their communities what's best for them. But oftentimes the earmark process was weaponized against the party that was not in power, the minority party. And so this new process allows for and actually requires that when there is a request, a grant request from a community in which a Republican and a Democrat, or two Republicans or two Democrats, but there's an overlapping of jurisdiction occurs in a request, that they have to be in agreement, that one can't take credit for it, that one can't use it against the other, but in fact, they need to start working together. Because if we're ever going to get the fiscal house in order, if we're going to get the alignment of the legislative branch with the executive branch and others, that it has to be in a bipartisan way. And one way that can bring Republicans and Democrats together is sort of working through this process together, just as Derek Kilmer, the chair of the Modernization Committee, and I did. He trusted me. He gave me a chance to draft a framework, present it to the committee, that of all things, back during a pandemic, after we'd gone through the longest government shutdown and an impeachment, this committee, the Modernization Committee, chose to unanimously adopt this framework and put it forward to the next Congress. That's something you don't hear about much. So it's worth taking a look at. And I'm excited, Kevin, that you brought these panels together to have this conversation today, to take a glimpse. Is it working? Is it the right framework? Are there adjustments that need to be made? And if so, guess what? The Modernization Committee is in place to adopt some of those changes. I'm sure they would welcome your thoughts and ideas. So know this, that Republican and Democrat conferences earlier this year adopted this framework, and Congress has begun implementing this new era of what we're calling community-focused grant program. And Kevin, thanks again. And I'm really excited about what you're doing here and for this conversation. And thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you so much for being with this program. And thank you for your leadership on this, the importance of reclaiming Congress's Article 1 power over spending. The importance simply cannot be understated. Now, we're going to transition over to panel 1 of the conference, which focuses upon analyzing fiscal 2022 earmarking. This panel features 15-minute presentations by Professor Zachary Corser of Claremont McKenna College's Policy Lab, and by Owen Minot, a policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. These two are presenting content and data and explanations that help give you, the audience, a sense of what's happened with this new program. So let me welcome them onto the screen. And let me also welcome my fellow discussant, Matt Glassman of the Government Affairs Institute. Both Matt and I will respond to Professor Corser and to Policy Analyst Minot when they give their presentations. This panel, just as a heads up, is going to run until about 2:25. Around 2:05, we're going to open it up for audience participation, but you don't have to wait to start queuing up your questions and comments until then. Instead, if you're watching the event and want to send a question in, go ahead and submit it to mikaelgood@aei.org. That's mikael.good@aei.org. Or you can tweet it at us and just use the hashtag #EarmarkReformAEI. Now, let's get to the content and see if we can learn a bit about what happened during this crazy year in Congress, which began with a January 6th, where we still had the pandemic riding out and a new program, the Community Grants Program, was launched. Professor Corser, would you like to start us off?
Yes, please. And thanks very much, Kevin. I'll just go ahead and get started because I've got a lot to say if I'm going to keep this to 15 minutes. My sincere thanks to Kevin and everyone at AEI and to friends at the Bipartisan Policy Center for being a kind of locus for research and discussion about earmarks in Washington. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about how the process has worked out so far. Also want to sort of mention and note that, the process is still ongoing. We haven't settled, of course, the budget for fiscal year 2022 yet. So this is a peek at looking at what was requested, what decisions committees have made in terms of funding. But of course, the process isn't entirely completed. But we have a lot of data and have a lot of information to look at to get a sense of how well it went, and also some ideas of perhaps how it could go better the following year. So Tom Graves did a great job basically summarizing why it is that this came back, this form of congressionally directed spending. There's a lot of different terms that are used depending on if we're talking about the House Appropriations Committee or the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee or the Senate. I'm just going to use the shorthand earmarks because we all know sort of what that means, but understand that as we move from house to house and committee to committee, their term of art differs slightly, but the purpose is the same. And that is, as Tom was talking about, the idea of Congress fulfilling its Article I responsibilities. Kevin and I wrote an article in February of this year talking about how, or rather I should say, what the effects of the earmarking moratorium were. We all remember, I think, back in 2011, that there was a moratorium by both parties in both houses of Congress to stop these kinds of spending initiatives coming from members. And we took a look and basically said, what has been the net effect of that? And the net effect we found was that it had no effect on reducing budgets or saving money. The primary effect was to shift spending responsibilities towards the executive branch and away from Congress. And we also saw that in doing so, the process became less transparent. And so we were looking to bring back earmarks, to encourage that. We're very pleased to see that the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress had a recommendation that looked very much like what we're seeing before us today. But I just wanted to highlight three things that we recommended in addition to sort of bringing back this kind of spending. Three things we wanted to be aware of in terms of rules and structure for bringing back earmarks. We wanted them to be transparent in how earmarks are reported and made available to the public. We wanted to build on what had been done during a brief period of reform in the House and the Senate to continue to reduce the potential for abuse by enacting post hoc audits, eliminating corporate earmarks, and strengthening conflict of interest policies. And then lastly, we wanted to see an increase in equity. One of the things that was part of this report was an interview with former members of Congress to determine whether or not they thought earmarks should be brought back and how earmarks worked during their tenures in Congress. And 9 out of 10 congresspeople we talked to, Republicans and Democrats equally, said we should bring them back. But one of their concerns was equity, that members had more of an equal share in the opportunity to apply for this kind of funding. So under those three considerations, I'm going to walk through both requests and funding decisions by appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. So first, I'm going to look at the House of Representatives. Here in a nutshell are what rules were put in place by House appropriations. Owen, after I'm done with my presentation, will be talking specifically about the process that Transportation and Infrastructure ran, which had slightly different rules. So I'm focusing on House appropriations and community project funding. So in terms of rules that were brought into place to help contain spending from earmarks, although looking back at the history of earmarks, they never really were budget busters. They tended to hover around 1% of discretionary spending. But the Appropriations Committee in the House took certain measures to help make sure that these would not become budget busters, that we would stay within our means, or rather that members would stay within their means. And so one of those financial decisions, rules, was that members be limited to 10 individual requests. Another was that all funding for this kind of funding should be capped at 1% of discretionary spending. So this year, it's estimated that should be about $15 billion for all of Congress. And then lastly, that the Appropriations Subcommittee chairs would issue guidance on which federal accounts would accept requests. The Appropriations Committee also looked at transparency. They said that funding requests be made available the same day as the committee markup or 24 hours before full committee consideration, if there was no subcommittee markup. So basically getting these out to the public as soon as possible. That members are required to post their requests on their official House website simultaneously with their submissions to the committee. Again, very transparent. And lastly, that the Appropriations Committee would post all member project requests, including a consolidated table of accessible data. And then moving on to talk about ways in which they could reduce potential for abuse. Probably the biggest innovation here comes right out of, I think, the Modernization Committee, and that is evidence of community support. That is to say, making sure that there's some evidence that a town council or a nonprofit or some community evidence is provided to say that this earmark is something that is needed within the district. This helps to build ties with the district. It helps to identify projects. And again, it also, I think, helps to build a cause or reason for the earmark. It sort of justifies it in a way. Members must certify that they, their spouse, and their immediate family have no financial interest in the projects that they're requested. This actually goes beyond what is currently required by House rules for financial disclosure. There was also a ban on directing funding to for-profit grantees. I think this is one big change that was important and changed the character of earmarking this year. Members may request funding for state and local government grantees and for eligible nonprofits, but for-profit grantees not acceptable this time around. And I think this did a lot to, if not in the public's perception, then I think in reality, to further diminish this idea of conflicts of interest or for-profit entities, searching for earmarks. And then lastly, requiring the GAO to audit a sample of enacted projects and report its findings to Congress. This is something that some former members had recommended, that in the past, earmarks were funded, and then Congress really didn't know what happened beyond that. In this case, there'll be some process whereby after these are funded, there'll be an opportunity for Congress and appropriations and the public to understand how this money was spent. So, how did participation go in the House of Representatives? Well, it actually went pretty well in a number of dimensions. One I would say is that the House GOP decided to suspend their rule on the earmark moratorium. And so the level of participation was actually pretty high, certainly in comparison to the Senate, which we'll talk about in a minute. 57% of GOP members submitted a request. Only one member, Democratic member, did not submit a request. And so about 80% of the chamber submitted requests. If you look over at this graph to the side here, you'll see House member requests by committee. As I mentioned, Owen will be talking about the Transportation Committee. You'll see there's a lot more requests for a lot more money in transportation. I think one of the primary reasons for that has to do with the fact that they did not limit the number of requests that members could submit. I think you saw a real difference in reducing the number of requests in House appropriations, and you can just sort of see it in comparison to transportation. While Democrats submitted many more requests than did Republicans, there was virtually an equal split there in terms of how much they were requesting, as you can see. If you look at where the money was requested from, this is a change from the previous era of earmarking, and I'll talk about that towards the end of my presentation. This just gives you a sense of what is it that Republicans and Democrats were requesting and in what proportions. Interestingly, transportation really was a key interest among members. When you think about the Biden administration's spending on transportation initiatives, the fact that the Transportation Infrastructure Committee was also taking earmarks requests, I think it's remarkable evidence of how important members think transportation-related funding is, that this happened to be the #1 category this year for requests, followed by energy and water, and labor, health, and human services. They sort of serve to be the top 3. You'll see that defense is very, very small. One of the reasons for that is this ending of for-profit earmarking. Basically, the only thing that you could request defense for was basically research and development types of earmarking. So there was really quite little of that, and that is a big difference from a previous era of earmarking. The total that was requested in the House of Representatives of the Appropriations Committee was $7 billion. The committee ended up funding about 60% of that, and about 92% of requests. So the requests were not funded fully, but it does look like House Appropriations made a real effort to try to spread the money around as well as they could amongst those who submitted requests. And the split in funding in terms of the Republican and Democrat, fairly even compared to participation, I think. About 70% of Democratic requests were funded, or I should say the amount was funded. About 50% of GOP requests, the amount was funded. But this actually, talking to former members, this split is actually pretty traditional. It was about a 55 or 60% split between the majority and minority parties in the past for earmarking funds. And so I think this is, a fair division, I think, by past standards and looking at levels of participation by both parties. So this is what was actually funded. Again, you can see the top committees here are transportation, energy and water, and labor, health and human services, and education. Republicans got a little bit more in the split on energy and water, most of the split on military construction. Democrats much more funding on labor, health, and human services. So let's talk a little bit about equity and how these funds were distributed by state. So 46 states ended up participating, plus DC and some US territories. The average amount of funding that was received by these entities was $82 million. You can see that by the red bar towards the middle there. You can see towards the left that Florida actually came out #1, about 7 times the average, just looking at the totals by state. California #2. Probably shouldn't be surprised California, New York, Texas are towards the top of this graph here, because of course this is by states, and there are many more members and much more population in those states. So to get a better sense of how these funds are distributed and how equitable they were, let's look at this per capita. And things even out quite a bit here. New Mexico actually comes out #1 at about 3 times the average per citizen of the earmarks brought back to the state. We'll talk about the Senate in a minute, but while there may have been more needs or interest, or just simply more success at the top end here from New Mexico, Louisiana, Florida, Alaska, Delaware, by and large, I think it was a fairly equitable distribution, again, considering participation by party. Although, one complaint that former members had was that appropriations tended to be overrepresented in this process, that appropriators tended to get more money, tend to be more aware of the process. So I decided to look at how Appropriations Committee members fared in the House of Representatives. And actually, in proportion, maybe even slightly less than the rest of the chamber. There's 54 appropriators, and they ended up getting about 16% of funding, compared to the rest of the chamber, who got 84%. So I think that appropriators actually look like they were appropriately represented, and that equity in the House of Representatives seemed pretty well represented compared to the past. Now let's talk about the Senate. Now, one big difference about the Senate is participation. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they also had their changes to rules regarding what they call congressionally directed spending. They did have a financial limit that funding would be capped at 1% of discretionary spending, just like the House of Representatives. They had similar rules for transparency, such as senators being required to post their requests and financial certifications online. Also, that they make requests publicly available online in a searchable format, and that funding decisions be made publicly available for these 48 hours before a floor vote. I'll say this about the House and the Senate so far. Again, it's still in motion. We haven't seen the final funded earmark request, that is to say what's been turned into law, and we may not for some time. But it was quite difficult, and I have to thank the assistant director at our policy lab, Liz Biscar, and a whole team of RAs for helping me go through a lot of PDFs to try to pull out what was spent in the House and the Senate. It wasn't the most user-friendly of formats, so that could be something improved in future in order for the public. I think requests were much better publicized than funding, but I think that's may yet to become once the decisions are finally made. Reducing potential for abuse, no personal or immediate family members having a financial interest, again, very similar to the House. This is kind of interesting and I think important, something the House may consider. You could make a point of order against directed spending that was not included in either the House or Senate bills. I thought this was an interesting way to prevent earmarks sort of slipping in outside of the process that was set up by the Senate Appropriations Committee. There was a ban on congressionally directed spending items for for-profit entities, mirroring the House again, mirroring the House. Government Accountability Office required to audit a sample of funded projects and report its findings to Congress. Notably, there was not a limit on the number of requests, nor was there a requirement for evidence of community support in the Senate. So participation in the Senate was very muted compared to the House of Representatives. As you probably know, the Senate Republicans decided to leave in place a rule continuing the moratorium, or in this case, actually an outright lifetime ban on earmarking. But the decision was made that while there wouldn't be an official end to that rule, that essentially the rule would not be enforced. And so there was a strong, I think, political incentive for Republican senators not to be involved. And as a consequence, only about a third participated. And so you see a fairly lopsided process in the Senate where a handful of Republicans and then most Democrats come together for the congressionally directed spending process. And Republicans in the Senate put in about 1/10 as many requests as did Democrats. You can see that lopsidedness in the amount of requests. Democrats in the Senate, a lot of requests for transportation, again, mirroring the House of Representatives. In this case, Interior and Environment came in at number 2, and Energy and Water came in at number 5, but they're all about similar there in between. Very few requests for agriculture and rural development amongst Republicans. Same is true of Homeland Security. The Senate requested a lot more than did the House of Representatives. Again, I think this has to do with not limiting the number of requests. We saw about $27 billion and 8,000 requests in the Senate, despite the lack of participation amongst Republicans. They did have to whittle that down to a number similar to the House of Representatives, about $5.7 billion, and they were managed to fund a little less than 40%. But the party, interestingly, given the lack of Republican participation, the Senate did manage to have a split virtually identical to that of the House of Representatives, which I think is, again, a fairly equitable split given who's in the minority and who's in the majority by past standards. The GOP, thanks to the fact that there are so few participated comparatively, ended up getting about 61% of their requests funded, whereas Democrats only about 14%. I think that makes sense given the fact there were over 7,000 requests. Looking at what was funded, again, a fairly even split given the lack of participation all along the line. Very different from the House of Representatives, though, was that military construction came in at number 2. Military construction in the past, before the moratorium, tended to be towards the top end of spending on earmarks. This wasn't the case in the House, but it was in the Senate this year. But energy and labor still represented towards the top. So looking at equity concerns in the Senate and looking at what was spent per state, only 38 states plus the District of Columbia participated. When I say DC, it's because senators had requested on behalf of the District of Columbia. The average per state was almost twice that of the average for the House of Representatives at 145 million. And then you can see, Alabama, South Carolina kind of leading here with Alabama at $552 million for their state. Of course, the ranking member in appropriations, Richard Shelby's from Alabama, which got me thinking, well, how did appropriations committee members figure into this year's process? And so this graph changes to turn yellow any state that has a participating appropriator. And you can see towards the top there, appropriators are very well represented above the average. And like the House of Representatives, to get a sense of the equitable distribution, I decided to do a per capita measurement. And we saw a similar phenomenon, perhaps even more exaggerated. This time, Vermont, number 1, 18 times the average. Of course, Patrick Leahy is the chairman of appropriations from Vermont. He came in at number 1 at 18 times the average. And other members of the Appropriations Committee sort of lead dramatically there and say the top 4th, 20% of states. So not as equitable a distribution. There's 24 appropriators that were involved in this process or submitted a request. They end up getting almost 60% of the funding. So I think in the Senate, they were less successful than the House of Representatives at making this process more equitable between members who are not appropriators. And just quickly, a comparison of past earmarking to sort of get a sense of what did this look like in the past. There was a brief period from 2008 to 2010 where Congress had a reformed earmarking process where we could track spending of earmarks. And so comparing to, and I've adjusted this for inflation to 2021 dollars, comparing what earmarking the amount of earmarks that had been spent in the past, you can see some big differences, both in amounts and priorities. First off, military construction, as I was saying earlier, used to dominate this process. And I think the elimination of for-profit earmarks has done a lot to limit that as a focal point of earmarking. And across the board, you can see too that there's just a lot less money being spent here in fiscal year 22 compared to the past. I took an average of 2008 to 2010, which again was about 2% of discretionary spending at the time. But these categories have gone down quite a bit. So it does seem like Congress, in bringing these back, they've certainly not broken the bank or gotten anywhere near doing so by providing this cap at 1%. So in conclusion, talking about differences between the House and the Senate and how this process worked, I would say broad participation helped the process in the House of Representatives to make this more of an institutional and congressional kind of activity that wasn't overtly partisan, but was more about members representing the interests of their districts. I think in the Senate, the GOP rules undermined broad participation and made it less of an institutional reform and brought more partisan division to it. I think spending was kept in check on both sides. I don't think it looks like, combining the House and Senate, we'll see what comes out of conference, but I doubt they'll get near the 1%. They'll probably come under. So this was not a budget buster. And as Tom was saying earlier, these never could be because, of course, they're percentages of approved spending from the Budget Committee. I think House of Representatives did a nice job of increasing equity between members. We saw, I think, a better even distribution between states per capita and amongst appropriators. I think in the Senate, there are equity concerns with appropriators being underrepresented. And I think uneven participation disadvantaged a number of states and again, sort of limited opportunities for a more equitable distribution throughout the 50 states. I think these abuse reforms or reducing the potential for abuse in both houses are very promising. We'll have to wait and see moving forward, but everything from the GOA audits to financial disclosure rules, I think are extremely positive. And I think also the House's interest in community support will do a lot, I think, to link these directly to community interests and not to political interests. And then lastly, as I said, transparency was very good in both chambers. I think we could use some improvement in publicizing funding decisions, but again, that may be yet to come. So with that, that's a lot of information to take in, but that's my look at appropriations, or rather the earmarking process in fiscal year 2022.
That was great, Zach. Thank you so much for that. And that's a very data-rich, information-rich presentation. And I just want to thank you and the policy lab at Claremont McKenna College, who put in a whole lot of time to put all that information together. It's extraordinarily useful, and I think it serves as a basis for trying to wrap our minds around what's happened with this program thus far. Let me hand the ball over now to Owen Minot, policy analyst at Bipartisan Policy Center, to inform us a bit more. Owen?
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. My name's Owen Minot, and like Kevin said, I'm a policy analyst at Bipartisan Policy Center's Infrastructure and Housing team. So Zach was mostly discussing the appropriations earmarks for community projects. I'm going to be giving an overview of the surface transportation reauthorization earmarks, which are totally separate from the appropriations process, and I'll explain that in a moment. But first, I just want to give a brief overview of this presentation. So I'm going to introduce what the surface transportation bill is, along with the rules and process for this year's earmarks. Then I'm going to give a brief overview of the projects that were requested in the aggregate, followed by some examples of projects, and then just touch on, to end off, a few of the advantages of having transportation earmarks and some considerations for the future. I also just want to highlight one key takeaway that I hope to thread throughout this presentation, which is that earmarked transportation projects are often great projects. I think even some supporters of earmarks think of them as just a necessary cost to pass legislation, but with the right safeguards, earmarks can bring real tangible benefits to communities. So the surface transportation bill provides budget authority for the Department of Transportation to continue spending on highways. It also funds bridges, transit, and rail. And unlike annual appropriations bills, surface transportation bills typically authorize funding every 5 to 6 years. So that provides fewer opportunities for earmarks. This year, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, which oversees the surface transportation bill, announced that individual members could request funding for specific projects in their districts. So these would be funded through the Highway Trust Fund, which gets its revenue mainly through the gas tax and would not require a separate appropriation. Before I dive in, I just want to add a little bit of context about BPC's involvement in the surface transportation earmarks discussion. So BPC's infrastructure team started to explore earmarks as a policy tool through our work on the gas tax. We have concerns about the insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund and have supported raising the gas tax one last time and indexing it to inflation, among other sources of revenue. So as a part of a larger set of recommendations about the Highway Trust Fund, we recommended restoring earmarks for the surface transportation reauthorization bill. Voting to raise the gas tax or any other increase in revenue for the Highway Trust Fund is fairly unpopular. So we felt that restoring earmarks would allow members to make a tough vote for something important. And then when they go to their districts and constituents are complaining about rising gas taxes or any new user-based fees, they can point to popular, useful projects they brought to their districts to balance that criticism. So when the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee announced they were bringing back earmarks for the surface transportation bill, I started tracking those project requests. So most surface transportation funding is provided to states through grants. So earmarks are a rare opportunity for federal legislators to directly fund projects in their districts. For highways, as you can see, most funding goes to states, and for transit, most funding goes to local governments and transit agencies. So there were concerns about earmarks being associated with corruption or wasteful spending in the past, as many of us know. And so that led House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chair Peter DeFazio to announce some rules and safeguards to limit the amount of spending while keeping the process transparent and fair. And these are somewhat similar to the Appropriations Committee rules. But for this committee, there was actually a cap to how much each member could request. Though many members actually submitted requests that far exceeded that cap anyway. And members also did not need to vote in favor of the bill to receive that funding. There was also guidelines that favored projects that are on the TIP or STIP. So that's the Transportation Improvement Program or the State Transportation Improvement Program. And these are plans prepared by states or regional entities to guide the use of federal transportation dollars. So to be clear, most of these projects were already going to be funded without additional federal support. Additionally, members were not allowed to request funding for for-profits like with the Appropriations Committee. And there was they had to produce documentation to allow for transparency and to demonstrate the viability of projects. So that included posting all of their projects on members' websites. And the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee recommended that projects advance one of several priorities. So that included safety, reducing emissions, multimodal transit, accessibility, and equity. So the committee went through thousands of submissions and after vetting, selected about 60% of the requests to be included in the House Surface Transportation Bill. However, those of you who have followed the process know that these earmarks did not make it into the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. It was the Senate's 5-year surface transportation reauthorization that made it into the bill, and that did not include earmarks. So to be clear, these House earmarks have not been authorized. So now looking at the aggregate data a little bit, nearly all of Democrats and about half of Republicans requested projects. About 60% of projects were approved, and most individual projects were about $1 to $5 million. And then remember, there was a $20 million cap, and 70% of members with approved projects received between $17 million to $20 million in total earmarks. So this means that most members received about the same amount of money. And breaking it down by party, even though Democrats got more funding in transportation earmarks, that's simply because more Democrats made requests and a higher percentage of Republican projects were actually approved. Now looking at the types of projects, and note that this graph represents the requests and not the approved projects, but most projects were roads and bridges. This is the highway bill after all. And so that includes repaving and maintaining roads, expanding and widening roads, safety improvements, and repairing and constructing bridges and overpasses. But there was also a sum of money for public transit and rail. So that includes maintenance, expansion, modernization projects, as well as some zero emissions bus initiatives. And then there was pedestrian and biking projects. So that includes bike lanes, trails, greenways, and adding wheelchair accessibility ramps. Now, looking at the total cost of projects by state, you'll see that states with higher populations have more funding in earmarks. And that's not surprising because, like I said, with the cap on these earmarks, most members received about the same amount. But because about half of Republicans didn't request earmarks, red states tended to have a bit fewer earmarks. You'll also see that projects were in every state except Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota, where none of the representatives made requests. And I also want to highlight that you can't see this on the map, but because these earmarks are eligible for every district, this is not just an urban benefit, but there's a pretty even urban, suburban, rural split. And I couldn't fit Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico on this map, but they also received funding that was pretty proportional to the congressional districts they have. And thanks, Zach, for also providing this data. And then looking at the number of projects, there's less of a correlation between state population and the number of requests than there is for the total costs. And that's because some representatives requested more projects of less value and some requested fewer projects of more value. So now let's take a look at some of the individual projects requested. Ruben Gallego represents the hottest major city in the US, which is Phoenix. And that's not just uncomfortable, but it's a real public health issue. And so he requested funding for cool pavement on roads, which can substantially reduce surface temperature in communities by over 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So I think this project is a good illustration of the fact that transportation infrastructure isn't just limited to moving people around. It has a huge physical presence in communities and can have a lot of significant secondary effects. And so this is a pretty cool project, no pun intended. And then, as you saw on the graph earlier, most projects were roads and bridges, but certainly not all of them. Here we have an all-purpose trail that adds a biking and walking path that can be used recreationally, but is also located in a way that can serve as a commute or a way to travel around for residents. And it's worth noting that this project actually was not included on the STIP, that state transportation plan. So Representative Gonzalez was trying to fund a project that otherwise necessarily would not have been funded. And then finally, this is my parents' district, and I'm a huge fan of the MBTA commuter rail, but I've definitely experienced some frustrating delays. So on this line, which goes from the suburbs north of Boston into the city, there are stretches of single track. So when trains break down on the rail, it leaves everyone stuck who's trying to get into Boston. So this project would add about 6 miles of double track. So finally, I just want to touch on a few of the benefits of introducing earmarks to the surface transportation bill. So I think the main reason people often think about earmarks being useful is that it's become difficult to pass almost anything in Congress, even really crucial legislation such as the surface transportation bill. And earmarks can incentivize bipartisan negotiation. It can give members the cover to vote for an important bill with controversial provisions like a gas tax. But like I said, these are also really high quality projects. And I think that's a result of the responsiveness of members of Congress to local needs. Members are highly invested in choosing projects that are important to their constituents, and they're elected, unlike bureaucrats. So they're very attuned to their constituents' needs. I think you can think of earmarks as wresting control of a tiny portion of infrastructure funding away from bureaucrats and to elected officials. So for example, if rural parts of a state have a difficult time getting state agencies to pay attention to them, they might have a better chance with a legislator for their district. And also the transportation spending process has been very leadership driven. So this lets members have more of a say in the process. And then finally, just to end with a few considerations, if they decide to bring earmarks back for surface transportation bills, the first thing I want to question is whether members should be limited to TIP or STIP projects. Remember, these are those statewide plans. So TIP and STIP projects are already going to be funded without additional federal support. And arguably, programs called out for direct federal funding in legislation should be an opportunity to address unmet needs. So perhaps with more flexibility, members could more credibly take credit for projects and maybe be more innovative in the projects that they choose. I also want to touch on the timeline for requests. So House members had less than 2 months after the committee announcement to accept proposals, evaluate potential projects, and submit requests. And that's a huge challenge since 70% of members had never dealt with earmarks before. So with more time, they might be able to choose projects that are more complex and not necessarily shovel ready, as opposed to just projects that already have the most organized support. And then finally, I just want to touch on transparency. The measures of transparency, like publishing projects on the website and certifying no public interest, are a huge improvement. And we applaud Congress for introducing those. But for people like journalists, constituents, and researchers who want to see more information about the projects, it could have been made a little more clear. So on the personal member websites, for example, a lot of members simply just included the names of their projects, but no description, which is not helpful since it doesn't make clear what they are. It sort of felt like they were checking a box for transparency, and they should have been required to include a description of the projects. Now, many members did include those, and those were really useful, but all of them could have. And then just the last point I'll make is that the list published by the committee website just included the names and costs of projects. And I think if they had broken down projects by the type of program, so just saying even if a project is part of a highway program or bridges or transit, that would have been really useful. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Owen. That was terrific. And I salute you and I salute BPC. You've been such a great partner as we've watched Congress work through how it was going to create the new community grants program, and then also, once it was launched, how they were going to implement it. So thank you so much for that. We've already got questions coming in, but I'm going to encourage even more to come in. Again, if you want to get your questions or comments in, send them to McKael, MIKAEL.GOOD@AEI.org, or you can tweet them at us at #EarmarkReformAEI. We've heard a lot of information from Zach and Owen. What do we make of it? Well, to start taking that question on, I'm going to turn to Matt Glassman of the Government Affairs Institute. Matt and I used to work together at the Congressional Research Service. This guy's been studying Congress a very long time. He even spent some time working on the Hill as a detailee, working a little bit in appropriations. And so who better to hear from? Matt, go ahead. What do you think?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, everybody. Pleasure to join you here. And I did work appropriations for 2 budget cycles. Luckily, I didn't have to work earmarks. This was in FY09 and FY10, right at sort of like the peak of the pre-ban sort of earmark craze. But I was working legislative branch subcommittee, and we didn't have any earmarks. So I watched it. I sat next to the man who was in charge of managing the earmark database. And it really was the Wild West, crazy days. And I was very sad to see the earmarks go. I'm a huge proponent of earmarks for their value in helping the legislative branch and individual members and individual districts. But those were certainly crazy days. And I certainly favor all these reforms we've seen recently to bring earmarks back, but within a context of a number of safeguards. So I want to make sure we get to people's questions who have in the audience, but I want to make 3 points before we do that. And first, the data I'm seeing here is presented by Zach and Owen, and thank you so much for these great presentations, gentlemen, putting this data together and making it available to us as a true public service here. This data is really heartening to me. We seem to have been able to recapture the lean meat value of earmarks and cut out a lot of the fat. In particular, the House cap seems to have really gotten at the equity issue in a way that I think is really important. Zach mentioned the GOP Senate being cool and ending the ban, but it really looks like the House cap providing a situation where you get 90% plus of the requests funded is a genuine move forward. I certainly remember in 2010, the animosity that built around the Appropriations Committee was really part of the problem, as much as anything else, that a lot of backbench members felt completely shut out of the process. And it seemed at times that the people getting the earmarks were essentially cardinals on appropriations, powerful people in other committees, and then frontline members that the leadership was directing earmarks to, or people who needed to be sort of convinced to vote for things. And so this seems like a much more equitable way. And of course, the move towards directing these only to nonprofits seems, from a policy point of view, inarguably in advance. So I'm really happy to see the data that this has worked out in a way that has brought a lot of spending direction back to Congress without heading back towards some of those inequities. Second, though, I'd like to see more data on a number of fronts, particularly on freshmen and frontline members. One of the old sort of public outcries about the earmarks, at least at the chattering class level, was that they were used sort of as re-election tools, and that the leadership funneled tons of these things towards sort of people in marginal districts, particularly freshmen running for their first re-election. And the rest sort of went to powerful members of the Appropriations Committee. And so who is asking for the big money here? We see 90% of these people are getting their requests, but who is asking for the big money, and are they getting the big money? And that's a different equity issue than sort of a state by state equity issue. But is this being used sort of as an electoral tool, for better or worse? And there's certainly reasonable ways to defend that. And so that would be a second cut of the data I'd like to see, is who's asking for a lot here. And third, and perhaps sort of the thing I'm most interested in this, is the role of leadership in all this. When I think about earmarks, I think about three benefits, or three buckets of benefits that earmarks have. One is undoubtedly the benefit to the legislative branch, to have control over the power of the purse, and have sort of members deciding where projects go rather than sort of GIS 13s over at the agencies. Second is the benefit to the individual member and their district, to bring projects to specific needs in specific districts. But the third benefit that always existed to the earmarks was the benefit for the leadership and for the appropriations process. As Owen pointed out, these things are often used as side payment incentives to buy up votes for bills. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. People look down on that, but this is legislative politics. And getting votes for bills, particularly bipartisan votes, is a good thing. It just is. And making the appropriations process move easier would be a great thing. If executive budgeting and congressional appropriations process got back to something like what it looked like even in 2007 or 2008, that would be a wonderful step forward for Congress as a whole. But there's a certain tension between the equity issue and the leadership party goals here in advancing, using these as tools of bill advancement. Because if everyone's getting their earmarks, we don't really seem to have the ability then to target them at members who we might want to get votes from. And also, I didn't get a sense from any of the presentations about how these things have played out at the voting level. I mean, the old saw at the committee was that you got your earmarks, but then if you didn't vote for the bill, they came out in conference. And so I'd love to see some work on that, about whether the leadership is sort of using the earmarks in this way, and nudging members towards voting for bills if they get an earmark, or perhaps mildly threatening them that the earmarks can come out in conference if they don't vote for the bills. And maybe it's not possible to make people vote for the bills anymore, that the partisanship is too high. And of course, we only have 3 votes in the House, right? We have the package vote, we have the state foreign ops vote, and we have the ledge branch bill vote. So we probably don't have a lot of leverage on this question yet. But, again, I would say there is a tension between this equity issue and this third use for earmarks for smoothing out the process and greasing the skids. And so, going forward, I would like to see some. I mean, the data's all there. We can figure this out. I'd like to see some work on that. I'll stop there so we can hear from the audience, or perhaps from you, Kevin. But that's how I read the presentations. And again, I'm very optimistic and heartened by what I see.
All right. Before I turn to audience questions, I want to give Professor Corser and the first bite at responding to any of the comments, and then we'll move next to you, Owen.
Sure. Matt, thanks so much. I insist on noting that Matt teaches in Claremont McKenna's Washington, D.C. program, that the students love him, and it's wonderful to see him, and thanks to him for coming today. Yeah, a number of things I'd like to say. One is I totally agree with you that another cut of this could be looking at seniority, freshmen versus those who are more senior. Another cut of this that I would like to see that I've begun working on, and this came out of member interviews and understanding earmarking in the past, is that talking to former members, they were particularly concerned that if you were from a more rural district, that it was more difficult to get more formulaic grant-based funding from the federal government. And that they saw the end of earmarking as being having a particular effect on those rural districts. And so I want to look more into whether or not this process helped to open up a stream of funding to rural America that may have been cut off during this moratorium. So definitely want to continue to look at the numbers and take different cuts at this. I couldn't agree more with you, Matt, on this sort of trade-off between politics and, say, sort of, straightforward grant making. And I think we've got something of a hybrid here. The Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress definitely came at this more from a, say, community-based grant making kind of perspective. And, there's a trade-off if you want to push it towards that side. And the trade-off is, as you say, kind of political in the sense that, in terms of marshaling votes, for example, as a leadership tool, I don't know that this can be used quite in the same ways that it was, and I'm uncertain at this point, although I'm still looking to see if this can be effectively used as a leadership tool. One thing I would say, though, that's been, it just has, I think, more to say about politics right now. the sort of polarization that we're feeling, particularly around budgetary issues, is one thing that happened in the past is that the belief, at least among members, was that the earmarking process helped to bring more consensus, particularly on appropriations bills, that if everyone had something writing on an appropriation bill, then the votes on appropriations bills tended to sail through a little more, and that there was a better sense of bipartisanship in the whole process. This sort of like, everyone's got money to bring back to their district. It won't necessarily be an even split, but minority, you get this percentage, you do with it what you will, and we'll support it. And so it actually introduced a degree of sort of institutional care or power that wasn't particularly partisan, because everyone bought in, and it tended to incentivize votes again for appropriations bills. So far, I really haven't seen that incentive coming out of this process. I don't get the feeling that members have been particularly motivated by having more local skin in the appropriations game. And I think that just may have more to do with the sort of extraordinary moment we're living in terms of the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress and their plans for spending, and the chasm between the two parties right now on spending issues. So I don't think that means that earmarking isn't useful. I think it is extremely useful. I hope that we're demonstrating that, but it's certainly not a panacea, and it's certainly this year up against some really tough partisan odds in terms of the way politics is playing out with the budget process.
Go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, so Matt and Zach mentioned this tension between equity and utility as an incentive. So I think that I would just add that kind of begs a question, if we bring back earmarks, whether there should be this maximum amount to how much members can request. That really is what I think keeps the amounts really similar. So it does increase fairness, which I think is important, because as Zach mentioned, in the past, committee members and House leadership receive far more in earmarks. And there's also some research, for example, that shows that Black members of Congress have historically received fewer dollars in earmarks for their districts than their white counterparts. But also the cap limits the ability of rogue members to request just huge projects that are totally out of step with state planning goals. Again, on the flip side, the cap restricts how ambitious the project's members can request is. So if there is some large unfunded need in certain districts, these earmarks can only fund a small portion of those, and it prevents the possibility that underinvested districts could actually request more. And I think the main point is that this may limit the effectiveness of earmarks as an incentive, because the committee cannot approve more expensive requests for swing members trying to secure their vote. But maybe that's a good thing. We have to ask ourselves if we want swing members to have such disproportional bargaining power to request really expensive projects. And I think at this point, we still want to ensure earmarks are brought back in the future. So in the early stages, we're still looking for buy-in. So we don't want any members of Congress who aren't getting the huge earmark requests to think that it's unfair for them and to turn against the process, I think.
Yeah, thank you much for that. Just to briefly get to my own take before I start giving you audience questions, which are pouring in. Thank you very much, all. The debates around earmarks and their utility for the legislative process, et cetera, they often hover around these kind of roughly four different ideas. A, there's a constitutional principle. B, you want members to actually have something material to do and not just engage in symbolic politics and acting up in front of cameras and running for re-election and raising money. Third, augmenting bipartisanship, the log rolling phenomena. And fourth, do they improve the budget process? And my own read of the evidence so far is that, certainly the constitutional principle, the community grants program is a success. I mean, it literally restores authority that previously was lacking to most legislators. Of course, despite the earmark moratorium, there were certain big dogs in Congress who still got to direct funds around, but the vast majority of members, did not have a way to do that directly. So in terms of taking power from the executive branch and sliding it back and putting it in the hands of individual legislators, it's done that. Has it given members the power to actually do something? Well, yeah, that actually flows from it. All we have to do is look at these various grants being requested. This is not, the sort of insider Jack Abramoff, cozy DC dealing that the folks back home are not even, clued into. This was very much rooted in a kind of grassroots process. You had to reach out, you had to get people to submit stuff that they actually wanted back in your district. So connecting members to their voters, the program's done that. And I think that's a successful thing. And it forces members and their staff to focus on community wants. Has it augmented bipartisanship? That's third criteria. Not sure. And that kind of, I say that because it brings up the fourth point. It's something Matt and Zach and Owen have all commented upon, is that the budget process right now is so much not a process. And so until we get back to something more resembling, smaller individual appropriation bills working their way through, and members, if you requested a grant, being, held to account for actually voting for it, until we get to something that's a process that's similar to that, as opposed to this sort of omnibus thing, we're just not going to know if this is moving the needle at all. So with that, let me go to an audience questions. And the very first one, it looks like it is one for you, Professor Corser. An audience member asks, equity. Equity is listed as one of the criteria for the process. It sounds, however, as though equity is defined here as equity between parties, states, appropriators, and other members. Is my understanding of what you're saying here correct? Am I correct to also understand that this doesn't cover equity across the characteristics of the recipient communities, ethnic profile, ethnic status, rural versus urban, etc.?
Thanks for the question. I would say that in my reading of House appropriations and Senate appropriations, there wasn't attention directly towards those kind of equity issues that the questioner is asking about. As you could see from Owen's presentation, that transportation and infrastructure, they were a little more sort of normative in how they were structuring requests or the way they solicited requests. They wanted certain types of policies. They wanted a certain type of equity. And I guess what I would say is, one must be cautious in thinking about the whole institution and not a particular party, because those preferences for rural or urban or suburban, or preferences based on race or other kinds of, say, social norms, those can differ between parties. And I think you don't want to be overly prescriptive in the way in which you solicit these kinds of requests for a couple of reasons. One, because you want as much buy-in as possible from every member in the process. They don't feel that it's overtly partisan, that whatever party is in control is essentially trying to direct money to their priorities or their vision of equity, which can differ between the parties. Again, a more normative kind of evaluation. And then, secondly, I would say that, it's probably good to sort of leave it up to members. Although, admittedly, in the old earmarking process, there were many complaints among African-American members saying that, they didn't feel they were part of this process, and that was sort of another layer to the equity issue. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve attention. And I think it's something that could be looked in terms of outcomes, because we have so much more data to look at this time. But I will say that in some of the research that was done in the past, a lot of the reason that members were successful or not basically came down to a kind of, understanding of the process, a kind of proximity to the appropriations process or members of the Appropriations Committee, rather than, say, different kinds of qualities of the member or the district.
I can just add really briefly on the T&I side. Like Zach mentioned, they explicitly said that their preference was for projects that would advance the goals of the overall bill, and that means funding for underserved communities and projects that advance environmental justice. And I think, in this sense, the difference between equality and equity is taking into account where needs are greatest.
All right, thank you. Okay, here I've got it from a Hill staffer. This is a multi-piece question comment. First, a shout out to BPC for their incredible work on the earmark guides that were produced before and during the process. As a congressional staffer going through this process for the first time, these materials were incredibly helpful. Number two, what is your sense for the likelihood of adoption of earmarks that were only included in one chamber, but not the other? Next, have you calculated the average inclusion percentage for each member office? And finally, do you have data on which members were most successful in getting earmarks included? And I'm not sure if the metric there is if they went 10 out of 10 or if it is pure dollars. Zach, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I'm going to maybe I'll have to work backwards. You may have to remind me of pieces of this. But getting to who was successful, it varied by chamber, as you could see. In the House, I think it was a much more equitable process in terms of, most members requested around 7 or 8 requests for an appropriation, and I think most received about that. I think, as I said, 92% of requests ended up being funded. It's just they weren't funded at the same level. And I haven't really gotten into member by member in the House who was more or less successful in terms of amounts of money that were appropriated. But I did, in trying to take a sort of quick cut to see broadly how it happened by state, I think you could intuit that, for instance, New Mexico, in terms of the amount of funding, because they were limited by requests, you could see that they ended up getting a lot more money. So New Mexico seemed, as number one, was quite successful in this process. We could look into reasons why. In the Senate, you could trace this pretty directly back to, individual members and their success. And again, it was overweighted towards appropriators. Kevin, help me with the other two parts of that question. You're muted.
Sorry. Sure. There was, what's your sense for the likely adoption of earmarks that were in one chamber and not the other? And then inclusion percentage for each member office, and which members were most successful, which you were just speaking to.
So getting back to, I think, Owen, it's probably a question for Owen because, in terms of thinking about earmarks and how the process went, and we'll be talking actually in the second panel about the different accounts that could be charged to for requests that differed between the House and the Senate. It wasn't a mere image, but I think the biggest question are these House transportation and infrastructure earmarks, because there's really no analog in the Senate for the type and number and cost that is being requested by the House as opposed to the Senate. And I don't know how that's going to work itself out. Owen may have some more insights into that. Do you, Owen?
Sure, yeah. So I think in terms of earmarks that were in the House and not the Senate, I think what they mean is the surface transportation bill earmarks that were not authorized. And there was actually an attempt to put $6 billion for local transportation priorities in the Build Back Better bill, which was to try and shift those earmarks into that legislation, but that was eventually dropped to reduce the costs. So I don't think they will be. I don't really see a path forward for these earmarks to be authorized at this point. I think initially just the fact that the Senate didn't include them on their side kind of was what killed the chances for the House to advance these.
Got it. Another question from the audience. And this is something I think we're going to probably talk a bit more about in panel 2, but let's do a little preface of it. Question, how could Congress best structure and standardize the data from these innovations in earmarks so that we can share and scale knowledge about this bipartisan public good progress? This question is asked, especially in light of the fact that the House is moving towards an enterprise information architecture system, apparently, not just for correspondence management, but ideally for multiple functions. Anyone like to comment on that?
Well, actually, I think Ann Meeker in the second panel will be discussing this. PopVox has been doing a lot of really excellent thinking about ways in which we can, from a data perspective and a sharing of public knowledge perspective, shape this process, both in terms of an internal process of submission and decision-making, but also the part of the process that's public-facing. And, I don't want to be overly critical. There was, the decision to bring back earmarking and the timeline were pretty compressed this time around. And I think next year there will be more time for people to think through how the process works, which will take some pressure off of staff. I think staff did probably the best they could this time around, and frankly did a pretty good job in making particularly requests available to the public. But I would say, the Senate Appropriations website that listed all funding in terms of a public use was probably the best. It was really easy to navigate. All the earmarks were listed. There were links back to the member sites for more information about them. From a researcher perspective, it was pretty easy just to scrape the web and get all that information back. On the House side, things tended to be in Excel spreadsheets. It was probably a little less accessible to the public. Took a lot of work to sort of, particularly for transportation earmarks, to turn that into kind of a usable format. I think there could be a lot more done to give a kind of searchable web-based database, but I don't think it's a lot of work on the other end. I think it would just take a little bit of planning and a little bit of thinking about, the users of this data and how they could say, make an overall data set available and also a publicly searchable and sort of easy to use web-based database.
Yeah, I was a little surprised to see how much data was being just kind of dumped into PDFs or put into members' web pages. But then it occurred to me that despite the House issuing and the Senate issuing some guidance, this was not guidance down to the very finest details. It was not specifying each and everything, and this left it open to various offices for interpretation about how to execute this. So you had at least 535 players, small businesses on the Hill, basically, who were trying to figure out how do we take the words in these memos and actually turn this into a workflow.
Well, and to heap praise on the House and the Senate, I mean, compared to the old days, the pre-moratorium period, it was really difficult to get this data into one single source. This tended to be, not only in PDFs, but buried into member letters for requests and in committee reports. It was really difficult to extract that data. So this is light years ahead of where we were.
Yeah, I see Matt Glassman nodding. And before I grab another audience question, I just want to tee you up because you were there at CRS in the days when earmarks became a very politically intense issue. And the agency put together a report, at least one report, that aimed to kind of compile all the earmarks for 1 year. But there was just no data source per se. This was a patch job because the whole system was so opaque.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, prior to the House instituting its transparency rules in the late aughts, earmarks didn't exist as a legal term. And so what was an earmark and what wasn't an earmark didn't have any sort of definition grounded in the process. And so anyone who was trying to do it, be it outsiders or CRS, trying to count them up was invariably going to have to make judgments at certain points about what actually was an earmark. Then when the House stepped in with its transparency rules and said, well, these are geographic based fundings of money requested by members, they actually came up with a definition that was usable. But until then, it was certainly completely opaque. One thing I would say on this matter is that, like, members love earmark transparency. When the first transparency rules were put in the aughts, some people were like, oh man, what is this going to do? Are the members, I think some of the good government type people thought that maybe this would reduce the number of earmarks members would request, but members loved it because then they could have a website they could point their constituents to and say, look at all these things we're requesting, and look at all these things we got. And so the transparency of the actual requests, something members are happy to publicize, right, and get out there. On the data side, the things I'm certainly interested in are making sure all the data about what's funded, how much is funded, and and who requested it is all sort of like machine readable, compilable in one data set, right? It's more sort of a tech side, but members aren't going to fight sort of like the transparency of this stuff. In most cases, they loved it.
Makes it easier to credit claim, which is something they frequently like to do when they're not shifting blame. Question, looks like this one might be best for you, Owen. Were members in contiguous districts or states able to make joint requests for infrastructure that benefited both districts or states?
Yeah, so there were representatives that made joint requests for projects. I think one of the examples in my presentation, Seth Moulton's double tracking was, a stretch of 6 miles that went into a different congressional district. So that was requested by him and the member of Congress in the district next over. So I think that they were allowed to do that, and they were able to do that. Again, unfortunately, these requests were not ever, authorized, so they were not successful in getting these implemented. But I think that the process was accepting of joint requests and opportunities to implement projects that went across affected constituents in multiple districts.
I just want to give a yes and to that to give a little bit of detail. I think one of the strengths of the old earmarking process before the moratorium was that it was very common for multiple members, sometimes a whole state delegation or regional members that happened to border one another, to co-sponsor. And there was a lot of co-sponsoring in the Senate because there was no limit on the number of requests that could be submitted. In the House, because you could only submit 10 requests, what you ended up having is 2 members, sometimes as many as 5 members, making essentially the same request. And then, I sort of, in looking at that, would count the amount that was funded as being divided equally amongst those members. But it's a little awkward. The House did change, the Appropriations Committee did alter the rules at a certain point as they were thinking through how to do this, to say that other members could endorse projects as part of your evidence of community support. So there was a way in which other members could speak, in favor of this. But it would be nice, I think, and effective if members could find a way that it wasn't sort of counting against their total or not in the same way, if they wanted to combine with colleagues to sort of demonstrate regional needs for certain kinds of earmarks.
Excellent. Looks like another question for Owen. Were you surprised that apparently a higher percentage of GOP transportation earmark requests were approved than disapproved?
Not entirely. I mean, one of the reasons the committee brought back earmarks is because earmarks are supposed to be a tool to incentivize participation. So if they were hoping to attract bipartisan support for the bill, that would make sense to accept Republican requests on the Democrats' side. Also, if you're a Democrat leader who believes in transportation earmarks, you want to increase bipartisan support for the process of earmarks. And I think that the way that you do that is to get Republicans on board by being fair and nonpartisan in allocating earmarks. So yeah, I think this reflects a strategy to get support for their bill in the short run, which was ultimately not successful. And then in the long run, to try to make earmarks less partisan so they become a permanent feature of highway reauthorization bills.
All right. We have about 3 minutes until we're going to take a very short break. So I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions, and we'll try to do them quickly as we can. What's the future of this program? Do any of you have any concerns about the future of this program? Let's start with you, Zach.
We're talking about the intense partisanship around budgetary issues that we're experiencing. And I don't want to be a pundit, but people are looking forward to the election or thinking in the future about the election in 2022 and the fact that the House of Representatives may end up changing parties. And we saw the lack of participation by Republican members of the Senate. So I'm a little concerned that this process may stop before it even got started if, moving forward, the feeling is that this is a partisan issue. And so I think we're in a tricky fledgling moment here where it's really up to members, academics, members of the public, people who were benefiting by this process to speak out about how they thought this was a helpful, effective reform. Otherwise, if it does sort of become seen as a kind of partisan initiative and not an institutional initiative, I think it will undermine the process, and we're unlikely to see it to continue beyond 2022.
Oh, and do you have thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah, I would agree that my main concern is maintaining bipartisan support for the process. It's encouraging that half of Republicans participated, and in today's Congress, if one whole party and half of another party support something, that's very bipartisan. So these are these are important transportation projects that bring tangible benefits to communities, and I think because Republicans have been in the minority and have had less of ability to influence legislation. For a lot of members, this could be the clearest accomplishment they could take to their district and claim credit for. So I would hope that along with trust in the process from some of these new rules and safeguards, would increase support among legislators. And then in terms of constituents, assuming these earmarks are enacted, members of Congress should really tout these projects so that voters understand the benefits of earmarks. I think that for these in the weeds legislative tools like earmarks, voters often sort of just follow the lead of their preferred politicians or their preferred news source. So I think popular opinion will depend on what policymakers say and what the media says.
It's 2:25. Matt, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is that this is the sort of issue that's always ripe for sort of demagoguery, and there's always going to be entrepreneurs looking to attack it. And so, a couple missteps with projects that really aren't up to value will unleash some members looking to entrepreneurially go for a ban, and then all of a sudden you'll have congressional challengers doing the same thing, and it can snowball. And so I think these current reforms have done a good job of minimizing the chance of that. But you need to be very wary, because a coalition can build if the equity falls apart and all of a sudden backbenchers are annoyed by this. And then congressional challengers are once again complaining that these are sort of electorally driven. And then some, simple corruption scandal happens with them. These things can fall apart quickly. And so I would encourage sort of further refinement of the equity issues and the safeguards to make sure that these do look like the useful tools they are, rather than sort of incumbency tools.
All righty. Thank you, Zach, Owen, and Matt, for leading us in this conversation. We're going to take a very short break, coming back at 2:30, and then we're going to start the second panel. This first one was kind of laying out the data, the what happened, the how did it work. Second panel is going to take a closer look at the community grants program and ask, where are the points of friction? What worked right? What didn't work so well? And what are ways to improve the process? So I invite my co-panelists to go ahead and turn off their cameras and take a break. I'm also going to turn off my camera, but we're going to come back on at 2:30 in the second panel. That conversation is going to be led by my friend, Zach Courser of Claremont. Thank you all for watching, and come right back in just a couple.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Again, my name is Zach Courser. I'm co-director of the Claremont McKenna Policy Lab, and I'll be leading this second panel where we'll be discussing, if you want to think about the last panel as being somewhat retrospective, sort of what's happened so far, we'll be thinking about this panel as being a little more prospective, thinking about what should come in 2023 fiscal year in terms of thinking about ways in which we can improve the process, ideas related to, how staff thought about how this went, what is the staff perspective on earmarking? And I'm joined by some really accomplished panelists that have a lot of insights, particularly into the appropriations process, and also into ways in which we can leverage data and technology in order to bring and connect information and citizens to their government. So let me start by introducing Franz Werfensdobler. He is a senior advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He has more than 2 decades of congressional experience. During his tenure on Capitol Hill, he worked in the offices of US Senators Robert Byrd, who is no stranger to earmarking, Byron Dorgan of North Dakota, and Chris Coons of Delaware, the last of which he served as the Deputy Chief of Staff and a Senior Policy Advisor. He's also served on the Senate Appropriations Committee, so he has many years of experience on the Hill related to, on the Senate side, relating to appropriation. So Franz, thank you for joining us on the panel today, and thanks so much for all the work that you're doing in this area. We also have joining us Ann Meeker. Ann is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Pop Vox Foundation. which focuses on the creation and adoption of effective, responsible, modern infrastructure for democratic governance. She most recently served as Director of Constituent Services for Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, where she worked to use data and technology to deliver smarter casework services. So Ann is no stranger to the interface between data and government, and we're really glad to have her here. And I also happen to note that both Franz and Ann went to Oxford, so you've got that in common. And then we're very fortunate to be also joined by a current staffer, Ariel Marshall. She is the legislative director for Senator Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, who serves on the Appropriations Committee. She has in the past served as a Sam Nunn Security Policy Fellow and also as a Congressional Fellow in the office of Senator Mark Udall of Colorado. In addition to her legislative experience, she also has a PhD in chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and we're very excited to hear her insights from a staff perspective about this process this year. So the way in which we're going to organize this panel is that Franz and Ann have a presentation that they're going to jointly present, after which we'll have some time for a panel discussion that I'll lead. And then as we did in the first panel, we'll turn it back to you to ask questions. So please don't forget to send us those questions while the presentation is ongoing, because we look forward to including your input as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Franz and Ann for their presentation.
Thanks a lot, Zach. And as you mentioned, Ann and I worked together through much of this last year on this question of ways to help responsibly reinstate earmarks and to look at the issues that were really important to congressional members and congressional staff. So much of this presentation looks at a lot of those topics, but what I thought I'd do is, first of all, touch base on one of the fundamental issues, which is really important to the question of whether and how the situation got to be where it is. And that's, next slide, please. And that's this question of the impact of the decade-long moratorium. Really, there's been a very steep learning curve in the process for reinstating earmarks in that transition. This graphic shows both the Senate and the House, and that the red dots and the blue dots on this graphic indicate the members of Congress who had been elected prior to the ban being put in place. So effectively, what that meant is that 58% of the Senate and 70% of the House have been elected since the moratorium was put in place. And while it is not reflected in this graphic, what is even as much as important is the fact that committee staff and personal staff have turned over as well. So there is effectively an entire generation of staffers who are in the Senate and House who are also not familiar with that new process. Next slide. What has happened is that it's not just at the very last minute that earmarks are returned. There's been essentially a 10-year-long period where there were discussions of how to begin to modernize the process. As Representative Graves mentioned, he was a part of that discussion, and that continued over a decade-long period. And one of the most significant of those statements was put out by the Modernization Committee, as Mr. Graves had discussed. Many conversations on the House side, on the Senate side, several attempts in the past to do that. And while that ban was in place for that period of time, the Modernization Committee on a bipartisan basis made a very significant statement in the 116th Congress. And effectively, it was a way to reclaim the greater Article I powers. Next slide. There have been a number of enhancements that have been made from the previous period of time, a 4-year period when there were some reforms, as mentioned previously, 2008 to about 2010. There were additional conditions that were put in place that were very important. And those were key issues that were discussed on the previous panel. And as we have talked about, we're often using the word earmarks, but they were defined in different ways. The term of art has been key with some slight slight differences and distinctions on the House and Senate side, but the Modernization Committee has called them community focused grants. The House Transportation Infrastructure Committee called them member designated projects. The House Appropriations Committee called them community project funding, and the Senate Appropriations Committee called it congressionally directed spending. And next slide, please. One of the things that happened in the previous Congress is that the Bipartisan Policy Center's BPC action issued a number of recommendations. Those recommendations were, for the most part, taken up by the Modernization Committee, which we very much appreciate as we looked at this whole question about how to responsibly bring back earmarks in a transparent and an accountable way. I wanted to run through a number of these, of which this first slide shows some of them, but wanted to also be very clear that this review of the implementation process is primarily a reflection of the timing of where we're at this point. It's not a critique of the intent. We believe that there has been an intention to implement a number of them. It's just that we have not completed the fiscal year 22 appropriation cycle, which I'm focusing on here today. And so therefore it's hard to say that something has been fully implemented or partially implemented in some cases until we know that that first cycle has been completely completed. So this is a reflection of an ongoing process, not specific one-off actions. As you can see on this first slide, essentially that to date and so far that member requests have been put in those appropriations reports during the markup process, but we'll have to see what it looks like in the conference process and final report. So in this case, we're saying that these are partially implemented. In terms of a greater accountability, there have been a number of things that have already happened. And so in this case, we indicate that they've been fully implemented. We have had a little bit of discussion, and we'll continue that on House and Senate and how they followed through on the websites. Certainly, they've become much more accessible and available, but maybe not so much in a digital format that would be easily acceptable to, say, the media, to researchers and others. But members have, as previously indicated, posted those on the websites. They have been posted on the committee sites, and those letters indicating the no personal fiscal interest have also been provided as indicated. Another thing that was important for the vetting process is to ensure that programs are funded under authorizations that are current and that there be an ongoing evaluation process. So it is often a complex discussion to know what is currently authorized, but overall the goal is to ensure that member requests are funded through a well-structured program that receives periodic congressional review. And also that the GAO review process is intended to come into place, but has not begun yet because the fiscal year 22 process hasn't begun. In the Senate Ledge Branch report, it directed the GAO to begin to think about that process. Next slide. Finally, in terms of setting limits, the for-profit entities have been banned. Neither the Senate nor the House allowed a for-profit entity to be considered for any funding. And then upon evaluation of the combined Senate and House levels and comments today, it appears as if the House and Senate appropriations requests will not meet will be below the 1% level for total annual discretionary spending. One of the things that is different and that has had some discussion in the prior panel was the limitation on member requests. The House did set a limit of 10 projects per member and the Senate did not. There have been some questions about the equity of that. But one of the things that hasn't been yet discussed, which is, I think, of interest, is that with that limit of 10 projects per House member, it's a sort of internal discussion by the member, by the office, about which projects to put forward. This is a brand new limit that the House previously didn't have prior to the ban. That what projects do you put forward? Spreading it around your district, priorities for your committee or other priorities. Lots of different questions before the member submits those publicly. And so there are some larger challenges that need to be considered about distribution, and we want to look into that. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague Ann Meeker for some further comments.
All right. Thank you so much, Franz. And thank you to Zach and Kevin and AEI for hosting us today. The first panel discussion was absolutely fascinating. So really happy to be here. So yeah, as Franz said, so we've kind of gone through the high level overview for how these reforms happened and the incredible amount of thought that went into trying to redesign this program in a way that kind of addressed some of the concerns with it and opened up new opportunities. So what I'd really like to zoom in on and focus on here is the staff who are from there tasked with carrying out this new program and who are actually tasked with implementation. The success or failure of these reforms is dependent on a lot of factors, but in particular, dependent on the ability of member office staff to develop this new program, to understand this new information, to develop and run this new process, and also navigate the political challenges and opportunities this process creates. So I won't get into this too deeply here because I think some of the previous speakers have touched on it. But I will just say, as we heard over and over again from staff navigating this process, this was a real balancing act, that there were no sure wins here. That besides the top level possibility of success here of bringing real money into real projects in the district, there are also some kind of associated secondary benefits. If offices really work out a process to do this well, there's a chance to build or strengthen stakeholder relationships, to message a member's priorities and really build support and build a coalition around priorities in the district. And there are also some attendant risks as well. There's a chance for negative press on projects. There's challenges with improperly vetted recipients. And what I really want to focus on is that there's an enormous staff workload involved in setting this up. So while it's the member who's generally responsible for making this decision and the political calculus based on their district, should we participate or is it not worth it to participate in the earmark program? The job that staff are then given from there is, so how do we design a process that maximizes these benefits and minimizes these risks? And that is not easy. So just to put a finer point on the work that's involved here. So talking to staff who are involved in implementing these programs, we broke it down into 6 big steps. This will look different for every office, but in general, I think this is how we can think of the work that goes into this. So as we have established, as Franz mentioned, this is a new program, and it's also a lot of new staff. So we first had to put a lot of time into just understanding the rules, understanding the guidance from the subcommittees. And this is dense stuff, and it was not always presented in a way that was particularly user-friendly. So that's a challenge in its own right. Once you understand the program, then you have to communicate it out to your district. Like we said, if it wasn't user-friendly guidance and it wasn't easy to understand for staff, imagine what it's like for a tiny nonprofit or a tiny local government. So it's really on the member office to communicate how this program works and how should requestors consider this in their overall planning. From there, you have to design an intake process. I'll get more into this in a second, but that's also not easy. And then particularly for House offices who were limited to those 10 requests, you have to figure out how are you going to vet your applicants. What we heard over and over from offices is, how do we avoid asking for the next bridge to nowhere? This was really a political risk and something that took a lot of work and isn't necessarily an area of competence that offices already had. And then from there, you have to wrap it up, get it submitted to the committee, again, with all of the requirements for posting information on your website, wrapping up that evidence of community support, and then close out the process, close the loop in your district. So communicate back to the requestors who were chosen for your final 10, communicate to the folks who were not chosen for your final 10, which is a political balancing act in itself, and then keep folks updated as the appropriations process is ongoing. So if it wasn't clear, that is a huge amount of work and also figures back into our balancing act. And let me just put a finer point on what staff were handling right now. So they're not only handling setting up this new process, but this was also in a really bizarre year, and a year that was really tough for a lot of congressional staff in the districts and on the Hill. We've talked about these in other contexts, so I'm not going to get too deep into them, but we're still handling a global pandemic. Offices are still handling record demand for assistance from constituents. That's not only kind of confined to the district, confined to constituent services staffer, but really spilling over into all other areas of a congressional office as well. We don't need to get into this very deeply either, but it's been an unusual year for partisan threats and violence. And for many staff who are working from home, this is really personal, and this has been a really tough thing to deal with. If you're working from home, if you're handling constituent calls, tense constituent interactions, you might be doing that from your couch in your home, which is its own difficult process. And I think that really might start to hint at why we saw maybe some offices be a little bit more risk averse than they might normally be. Beyond that, also, I know some of the other speakers on this call have talked about this in other contexts. The amount of capacity available to congressional offices and congressional staff has been fairly stagnant over the last several decades. And what all of this combines to mean is that there's also been really high turnover this year. We're hearing anecdotally that it's a record year for staff turnover in Congress, meaning that it's also a lot of new staff handling setting up this new program on top of the normal appropriations process and the other demands of running a congressional office. So with all of that said, frankly, for us in talking to offices who are handling this, it's amazing that as many offices participated as they did. And beyond that, what really impressed us as we were watching offices implement these programs was how many offices really just knocked it out of the park. With all of these challenges, offices were still able to put together an innovative process that really served their districts and was user-friendly for their constituents. So I'm going to run through just a couple of examples quickly for offices that really went above and beyond. And I think that comes back to the biggest thing that I want to emphasize here is to improve this process. We're here to talk about improving the earmarks process, if assuming it goes forward. There is so much expertise and there's so much innovation already out there for the offices that handled it this year. So there are a lot of kind of hints at ways that we can use technology, and we can share these best practices to make it a lot easier going forward. So thinking back to our 6 steps for setting up an earmarks process, the biggest thing, like we said, you have to understand the process and then understand the rules and then figure out how do you get that information out into your community. And so some of the offices that did this thoroughly and most importantly, quickly, were really impressive. So Rep. Schreier was one of the first offices that we saw get information out, meaning that her constituents, her eligible requesters, had the most amount of time possible to prep, to understand where this is going to fit in their long-term budgeting, and to gather the information they need to make that request. So that's really important. You can just see from this quick screenshot for her constituent guide just how much work her staff put into making this clear and readable and comprehensive. So really impressed by that. And then, like we said, for those 6 steps, another big one is designing an intake process. In the tech world, this is its own special area of professional competence. You have a whole professional subset of user experience designers, of service designers who do this for a living. But as with many things in Congress, we ask congressional staff to figure it out on the fly and muddle through it on their own. So it's wonderful to see offices really put the thought and the time into a great intake process. Senator Graham, no surprise, big proponent of earmarks. Seems like his state is poised to really benefit from his request this year. So no surprise, perhaps, that his office had a great public-facing portal to submit those requests. I will say this table that you see here for his requests is also a really nice innovation. It's nice to see that he put the time into making it readable. Would have gotten bonus points for putting this up in a downloadable CSV file, but we can get into that more in a second. We can't have everything we want. Similarly, skipped one. Similarly, Senator Chris Coons, again, we talk about putting up a great intake process and getting information to people early, quickly when they need it. This office had the best intake process that we saw. It was really clear. They did a lot of conditional logic so that the requesters only had to answer the questions for the subcommittee they were requesting for, which is fabulous, but it does take a lot of effort for offices to do that. Let me just also flag in terms of getting information out quickly. This is the only office I've seen that's already has information up on deadlines for FY23. So great to see that. And then this is one of my favorites, again, for House offices. We talked about the care and the amount of work that has to go into vetting and also making that decision. So what we saw a lot of offices do was set up a community advisory board, which I think is fabulous. It's a chance to kind of get those stakeholders in your districts a chance to weigh in on the requests. So you have another data point coming in and another kind of emphasizing factor for when you're communicating your requests back out. Rep. Pappas did that, and not only did that, but also kind of started to show what a participatory process might look like for earmarks. So he also released all the requests his office got publicly and had a portal for constituents to provide input. So any constituent could write in and say what these requests would or wouldn't do in their community, which I think is a really exciting model. And then last but not least, this is a little bit of a present and future shout out. So Mike Simpson had a great constituent facing portal, great explanatory information on the appropriations process, which I know talking to nonprofits in this process is not easy to explain. It's just really hard to explain the appropriations process to someone who knows nothing about it. So great job there. What he also has is this cool kind of vision document for his regional priorities. And I think I'll be curious to watch for the next year if other offices kind of use this as a way to kind of funnel the requests that they receive from their district. So be interested to see if if a congressional office would say, hey, all of my accounts are open and I'll take requests on all of them. But what I really want to see and the requests that I will prioritize as a member are ones that further these priorities. Could be an interesting way to make this process more user-friendly for both staff and requestors. And I know that we'll get into this more in the discussion, so I won't spend too much time here. But so going forward, what am I watching for the next cycle? And what are some things some directions where the process could start to be improved? As a couple of speakers have mentioned, there were some open questions this year that I think will just be, in many ways, will be resolved as we watch the end of the FY22 process. So things like the account mismatch between House and Senate. The format and accessibility of training resources. I think there's a lot of room for not only the House and Senate appropriations committees, but other entities like delegations or caucuses to invest in training their own staff. And I think we could get more creative in the ways that we train new staff, not only in appropriations, in a lot of different staff competencies. As much as clearly I love a Zoom event, we don't need to do every training synchronous. We can invest in more video resources, more on-demand resources, more asynchronous text resources that I think would be helpful. And like I said, I'd love to see the committee and other caucuses, other entities highlight best practices and really facilitate some staff-to-staff best practice sharing and mentorship here. And then similarly for the member office level, what I'm hearing is offices are interested in kind of thinking about this in a long-term way. So long-term outreach education, taking a couple of years to get eligible requestors ready to submit requests. So I'll be curious to see how they keep doing that. And then, like we said, strategizing collaboration. I think this year, the game was so new this year that we hadn't figured out what the plays were going to be. How does it make sense to coordinate among the delegation, coordinate in a caucus? So I'll be curious to watch how that develops going forward as well. And then very last, I'll just say this quickly. We had a mention in the last panel from a staffer who said that they'd found these helpful. I was so glad to hear that. Thank you so much. We did put together some staff guides and staff resources on the new process. These are available. I'll leave this up here so folks can take a picture of the links available on these websites. And we are going to keep these updated going forward and develop some additional ones as well. One thing that I'll say, I think PopBox Foundation side, what we're really looking to focus on is we talked a lot about equity in the last panel, equity between members, equity between states. I'm also interested in equity, as I think one questioner mentioned, just equity in terms of who is in a position to submit a request and how can we make information on submitting a request accessible, transparent, easy to use to kind of level the playing field within districts as well. And with that, let me turn it back to Zach.
Thanks so much, Anne. Why don't we just continue with this thought? PopVox, I know, looks for innovative ways for government to share information that engages the public. What data-driven kinds of innovations do you see could be used in the next earmarking process? I know you've talked about ways in which data can be conveyed to researchers, but have you done some thoughts about either internally, like how this works inside Congress, or externally, the way it's reported to the public? Have you been doing some thinking, or has your group been doing some things about ways that we could do this better?
Yeah, sure. This is such a kid in a candy store question. Just all the different ways that we can reimagine earmarks and really think about how to turn this into an opportunity for beautiful open government data transparency. So for the next go round, I think a low hanging fruit would be, and I know y'all touched on this in the previous panel, just to make sure that this data is easy to use for researchers and easy to use for constituents as well. So so steering us away from uploading PDFs with data and steering toward making data available in machine readable formats and downloadable CXV files. I think that's kind of a low hanging fruit. Going forward, well, let me back up for 1 second. Before we talk about how to use data and technology to make this better, I think we have to go back to that staff capacity question that we touched on with member office staff. And let me just say really clearly, this applies to committee staff as well. The committees are also overstretched handling this new process. And committees also haven't necessarily had the resources to really invest in technology for themselves. So I think first step is committees realizing this is important and thinking about how can we invest in an expanded IT capacity, in bringing detailees from 18F or USDS to help us understand how do we push this out. And then just thinking about it for the long term, I think there's so many ways this could be really interesting. One thing I would love to see would be the committees not only making this data downloadable for researchers like yourself, but also for just ordinary constituents who don't have that data skill. So if the committee had a dashboard where constituents could go through and filter all of the different requests by a variety of inputs, would be really interesting to really kind of let individual constituents not just go through their members' published requests, but actually have a dashboard where they could just see, let me filter my members' requests by city, or let me filter by nonprofit or city or local tribal government. Would be really interesting.
Thanks, Anne. Great ideas. Let me take this opportunity to bring Ariel into the conversation. We've got a lot of researcher input. We've gotten some former staff members, but we're very fortunate to have a very busy and one might say important person show up and give her perspective, and that's Ariel. So thanks for coming today. Let's get the staff perspective. I mean, based on your experience working in appropriations, did you feel that this whole process of congressionally directed spending in the Senate, do you think it was helpful? Do you think that it actually helped to identify projects that, say, would have gone unnoticed by the usual process, the sort of, so what question?
Yeah, well, first, let me just say thanks to the organizers of the presentation for inviting me to join you in this discussion. There's been so many great things that have been talked about since the panel started. I can't wait to follow up with Franz and with Anne about in the future. So to your question, how has this really changed in how we interact with our constituents? So from my perspective, with Senator Shaheen being a long-serving member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, there are already connections that our office has with key stakeholders in the state. We start our appropriations process very early, having meetings really all throughout the year to try and make sure that the requests submitted by the senator are really representative of the needs in New Hampshire. I will say, however, that the congressionally directed spending exercise, quite a rigorous exercise, I'll say, really sort of opened up the discussion about who was chiming into our office about particular projects. So, instead of just sort of hearing from the state or certain stakeholders with really key equities in bills, we'd hear more from town managers and regional planners, really more than we have in the past. And that's not because those projects were overlooked by our office, but it's more so that the projects that were in focus are something that could have been rolled up into a state request, or something that, due to, a state program might already be fitting the need, but the waiting list is really long because this program is oversubscribed. So, all that to say is that this has really opened up who we engage with in a very positive way. And I also think our constituents appreciate a little bit more insight into the appropriations process. It's definitely been education on both ends of the spectrum. But from my perspective, while it has been a pretty arduous process, as Ann touched on, we're better for it, I think.
Since both you and Ann brought up this idea that was arduous. I know that it's early days, right? We just got this program started this year after a 10-year moratorium, and there was a pretty truncated space of time this year. So this year was kind of exceptional, but sort of if we can bracket that sort of special circumstances out, for Ann or for Ariel, are there some thoughts you have about ways or resources that can be brought to this process from the staff level that could help maybe make it less arduous for individual staff?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So the one thing, and Franz kind of touched on this as well, I think we had maybe 3 or 4 members of our staff who were here working for the senator before the moratorium was established. And so there was a huge learning curve. This year's schedule withstanding, instituting a process that requires this much transparency and accountability is something that you want to be very careful about. And so, not having as many people on staff who had been there before was, something that we had to figure out how to work around. And I think the same is true across all Senate office and also on the committee staff as well. So, that was something that we have learned. One of the things that we will be doing in the future is having more sort of info sessions for our constituents than we had in the past. It's very hard to sort of understand, especially if you are coming from a perspective where you apply for federal or state grants, where there are defined deadlines, there are defined processes, and when you'll be notified and when the funds will be administered. To then go and work with staffers on congressionally directed spending requests, where the schedule is, you have asterisks behind everything. That makes it a little bit more difficult to understand where the government funding was extended in the CR, but the earmarks aren't carried in the CR. Why is that not the case? Some of those sort of nuanced things that working on Capitol Hill that you totally understand, but off the Hill, it's a little bit more difficult. So having those information sessions will definitely be helpful. As far as things that we are hoping to see in the future, I think the technology definitely needs to catch up with the things that if we want to continue on this, because it is such a huge undertaking. We have sort of a portal in our office that's very established and set up to receive, discretionary appropriations requests. That portal was not ready for congressionally directed spending requests. And so we had to send out a paper form. Well, not a paper form, it was a PDF, but we had to send out a form where some sort of web portal would have been easier to navigate. And then also some of the, just the terminology, right? So what we saw was, people applying for water infrastructure requests to the energy and water appropriations bill. And that totally makes sense. But how the bill is structured, you would never know unless you worked on this issue that an energy and water appropriations bill does not fund water infrastructure projects outside of the Army Corps and BLM. So, that put more work on staff to make sure that those requests were assigned to the right bill. And so we are having those discussions within our office as to how we can sort of, through improved technology and through better coordination with our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, try to reduce the burden of both the applicant and also the work on staff.
Very much, Ariel, that's very helpful. Reminds me though, I don't want to put you on the spot, Ariel, but just in terms of if you can think of anything that's come through your office that you thought was exemplary of some kinds of projects that were submitted or that received funding, that could give us a little perspective on the kinds of things that you were receiving.
Sure. I think that the great thing about receiving congressionally directed spending requests, it's things that you would just not sort of think needed. These are things that are very small granular projects, right? So we got a lot of requests about replacing inefficient lighting with LED lighting, and we had not up until then been as granularly focused on that particular project. It's more about how do we make these really big federal and statewide investments in energy efficiency. But that starts with replacing these street lights to high efficiency LEDs. So there were a lot of those sort of requests that came in, which I really found, particularly because energy used to be my portfolio before becoming the senator's legislative director. Very encouraging to see that the communities in New Hampshire were heading that way. We had some really ambitious requests that I'm very happy to say were included partially funded in some of the appropriations bills. These are, one of them was a request from the University of New Hampshire to really sort of revitalize their grid, so provide some additional resources to make their grid more sustainable and more reliable. And it was sort of a phase 2 of a multi-phase project to really sort of shore up the reliability for both the school and also the first responders who rely on the grid adjacent to the school. So thankfully, we're able to get some initial funding there, and we hope to watch it grow. But both from a very small projects to changing the streetlights to LEDs to sort of large and figuring out how you can make a town that's very close to the seacoast more reliable so that extreme weather events doesn't take down the entire grid. I just really have found that to be very interesting.
Thanks, Ariel. Franz, I'm going to ask you a question about training. So BPC Action did a lot to assist in helping offices and staff understand how this process works. If you could, again, it was sort of an exceptional year because we were just getting started, but in thinking about that, putting those materials together and the outreach that BPC Action undertook, what are some thoughts that you have about thinking about training next year, ways that you could improve or needs that you saw amongst staff?
Sure. Thanks for that question. And I definitely want to give a big shout out to Ann and Popbox because it was definitely a partnership. As the new programs were getting set up in February and March of this last year, definitely saw a gap. So many new members, so many new staff, somewhat confusing guidance. We just figured we had to step in, we had to provide some direction, we had to say, here's the program that existed, here's some additional things you need to think about. So hopefully the types of materials that BPC Action and Popbox and others put together are a good start, and we want to continue to follow that process. But we also want to work with an appropriate entity in either the House or the Senate that can take that on internally. There's a major learning curve there, but these are the types of things that hopefully the committees of jurisdiction can take on to some extent, and the personal offices can continue to grow in their understanding of the programs. And there's sometimes a resource limitation, but putting some staff resources into growing a stronger program and having the right technology to do that. Outside groups should be supportive and supplemental to that, but we also want to help empower those committees and those personal offices that want to continue to grow this program. So many of the things that Ann has mentioned are a part of that. And we hope that this first year was just a way to help buoy and support a stronger program going forward.
And talking about coordination between House and the Senate, looking at the data in the last panel, there were a lot of ways in which the House and Senate rules about earmarking did mirror each other. But there are a lot of things that did not necessarily mirror one another. One thing that you observed in May was that accounts that were eligible for earmark requests differed between the House and the Senate. And we've already heard about House transportation and infrastructure earmarks and how there was no analog in the Senate. Can you discuss some of these differences to get a sense of how they didn't quite match up, and then maybe give some ideas about how we can do more to coordinate between the two chambers?
Yeah, absolutely. And here, let me share my screen again, because I am a very visual person, and I find it easier to look at the mismatch between the House and the Senate accounts. So as you mentioned, so this was the quick blog post that we put together to hopefully make it easier for staff and requesters to understand the differences. So you see the biggest thing is just the number of eligible accounts. I've just keeping this in mind and hearing about the differences between which requests were funded by subcommittee in the House and the Senate. The Senate just had so many more eligible accounts. So 60 eligible accounts for the Senate versus 41 for the House. Like we've talked about elsewhere, the kind of mechanics of making the request were a little bit different as well. The House required evidence of community support, and the House limited the number of requests. The Senate did not, but the Senate required a little bit more arduous certification letter process. So it was interesting there. The biggest mismatch, so as I'm scrolling down, you can see the accounts that were funded, that were open on the House side, but not on the Senate side, and vice versa. One of the big ones was defense. As was mentioned in the last panel, the defense earmarking was so different this year because of that. I think, as you mentioned, Zach, because the earmarks were closed to for-profit companies. Was also interesting was that they were open on the House side, but totally not on the Senate side. So I think that led to a lot of questions on both the House and the Senate about just how, just strategy-wise, how should offices think about submitting requests for accounts that are not open in the other chamber? Are those just going to get thrown out of the bill? Do those have more weight because there's no one to say differently on the other side? And I think that the answer to your question about how could we think about improving some of these mismatches or making them more easier for staff to understand and plan around kind of comes back to what we were talking about with training and thinking about future training resources. What I would love to see would be the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees coordinating on sharing best practices that offices developed, and also thinking about doing joint staff trainings. When we're thinking about just the success or failure of this program in general, I talked about this a little bit for individual offices, that offices have to be thinking about, all right, if we get none of our earmarks chosen, then how is this still going to be a valuable exercise, as Ariel put it for us? And I think about that for the chamber as a whole as well. So even if earmarks go away into appropriation cycles, how have we still kind of built value through leading us through this process? So I think building that muscle for training, building those muscles for bicameral coordination, and building individual relationships between staff in the different chambers would all be really valuable kind of secondary benefits to come out of an expanded training program and expanded coordination between House and the Senate Appropriations Committees.
Zach,
yeah,
if I could just add to what Ann said, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about this mismatch between the two accounts, or the House had 10 subcommittees that qualified or allowed earmarks, and that the Senate side had 9. This is a process that will hopefully get reconciled in the conference, as they're now looking at January, February for the fiscal year 22 process. So those subcommittees are going to have to decide how they deal with the House accounts versus the Senate accounts. And hopefully then going forward, they can decide on a set of accounts for fiscal year 23 to qualify, because it's important for personal offices to know which accounts to be thinking about and their constituents going forward. So this is the first year, this is the first experiment, and hopefully they can reconcile and settle this issue, so it's essentially a non-issue in the next cycle.
Let me remind everyone, if you have questions for our panel, you can submit them 2 ways. One, you can send an email to Mikael Good, that's MIKAEL.GOOD @AEI.org. You can also tweet with the hash mark, or rather, I should say the tag hash mark, earmark reform AEI, all one word. So if you have questions, please submit them either to mikhail.good@aei.org or tweet with hashtag earmark reform AEI, all one word. Franz, before I start opening it up to questions from our audience, Franz, I had another question. This is a tricky one. So it calls for a little opinion and speculation. And it was raised in the last panel too. And that's this question of, what is earmarking doing beyond simply, say, bringing resources to states and districts? In terms of, say, encouraging bipartisanship, encouraging or reducing dysfunction. For example, the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, in their call for reinstating a form of earmarking, they said it was to, quote, reduce dysfunction in the annual budgeting process. And so, you can choose what you'd like to talk about, but what effects, if anything, have you noted in this year's appropriation process that you think the return of earmarks might have had anything to do with?
Yeah, let me start off by saying one of the ways that this certainly hasn't been a normal budget cycle at all. The fiscal year 22 appropriations process might end up being only a very small part of the funding that gets enacted this Congress or this cycle, because we're talking about the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill, potentially a Build Back Better legislation. So this is the normal discretionary funding might only be a minor part of what gets funded, and then member requests being an even smaller part of that. But one of the things that it might have done is that there hasn't been the process on the House floor, and the Senate had a little bit more of a truncated process that this gives members who aren't on the committee or members who are in the minority at the moment a chance to participate and to sort of push for things that are important to their local communities or that they find important in their sort of legislative priorities. So that is a positive way, because there's not really a floor amendment process, or sometimes many of the majority of members aren't on those committees of jurisdiction, including what colleague previously mentioned with the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. So that's a positive. But certainly, again, this member requests are a very small part of the whole budget process being debated right now in a very partisan way. We haven't seen the bipartisanship come back in the way that there's been bipartisan votes for bills. That didn't necessarily happen with the infrastructure bill, and nor did it necessarily happen with House votes on appropriations bills. But it's also a part of the larger debate that's going on, without going into too much detail about the defense versus the non-defense funding or things like that haven't yet really fully been settled. So there's some bigger issues going on. As members get maybe more comfortable with it, that might bring back a little bit more bipartisanship in the voting process. But still, it has provided some value that's been probably outside of the viewpoint of the general public or the media.
Ariel, similar question to you. You're experienced in appropriations. You've seen how this process has worked in the past. Have you seen any net effects, so to speak, in terms of the way in which the process has worked itself out? Have you seen any bipartisanship encouraged, anything coming across the aisle, better coordination or work within the committee itself? Just any insights you might have.
Sure. I think this has been said quite a lot, and I'd like to say it again, because I think it's important to note that, this is a very unusual year with regards to appropriations, from the issuance of the president's budget on down, not getting that until May 28th, and all the other steps that come afterward being substantially delayed. So, with that disclaimer, it's really difficult to say how these congressionally directed spending requests have affected the bipartisanship that should happen, and which we hope to occur whenever we talk about federal funding bills. I will say prior to this year, we have seen, at least on the Senate side, within the committee, appropriations bills being marked up on a bipartisan basis for a couple years now. And so the hope would have been that, absent some of the sort of big things that have taken up a lot of the oxygen in the room this year, we would see something similar. In the bills that the Appropriations Committee did mark up this year, we did see bipartisan votes on those bills. So just noting that there. So again, Zach, I think it's just this is too much of an unusual year to say how it has affected bipartisanship. We in New Hampshire have an all Democratic congressional delegation, so I can't really speak to the type of bipartisan collaboration that has not from my state's perspective, but given how typically the appropriations process works, we, for example, will coordinate with our well, it's not exactly all of New England, but the Northeast delegation. So it's New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and New York, to make appropriations requests for a regional commission that's shared between the 4 states. That happens every year, and I'm sure if this was a normal year, we would see that equivalent on the earmark side. But again, it's just very hard to say.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. Okay, well, let's switch over to audience questions now. We have about 10, 15 minutes for that. One thing that was brought up in the first panel is this idea that is mirrored in the House and the Senate about the GAO doing selected audits. Of course, we're not to the end of the process yet. Hopefully we'll get there. Does anyone know where these will be published, or how this will be conducted, or how they will be reported back to Congress? Does anyone have any insights into how that part will work itself out?
I'll jump in briefly. The Senate legislative branch report gave direction to GAO to begin to think about it, and it wasn't lengthy or in any detail. So GAO has guidance to begin the process, and essentially they should do this for both the House and the Senate side. But a couple of thoughts just on that point is that hopefully there would be enough time for those member requests to be the funding to be directed to the community, and then the project funding to be set up and funded. If funds were made available or enacted in, say, February, it takes a while for the agencies to get the money and then get it to the community entity and then to be put to work. So hopefully GAO would give that amount of time. Another element that may be beneficial for GAO, if they were thinking about this, is that maybe they could set up a special unit or sort of aggregate different people from within GAO to look at some of these different types of requests. There's a great deal of diversity spanning all kinds of different interests and agencies, et cetera. So, sort of like balkanizing this in the different units within GAO probably may not be the best way. So maybe if they were to go forward, maybe they could have a small team looking at the diversity of the project. So that's just one thought on that. But I don't know that their GAO has begun a great deal of detailed process at this point, at least.
Thanks, Franz. I have another question here. This is for Ariel, or for Anne or Franz, if you have some insights in this. It's really kind of a process question. It's, can you help us understand where the budget process is now, and where we might get clarity on whether the congressionally directed spending proposals will be made?
So for the remainder of FY22, obviously we're in a CR until February. And as Franz mentioned, the leaders in the House and the Senate continue to work towards an omnibus bill, which we hope will be enacted when we get in next year very soon. So if that does happen, the expectation is that the congressionally directed spending request or the community funded projects, if you're in the House, will accompany that omnibus bill. I know that in my talks with my colleagues on the committee, that certainly is what they are working for, which, in order to sort of make this a more regular process, we would like to see so that we can get, as your earlier question, Zach alluded to, a little bit more information and sort of to see the sort of end result as to, how these earmarks can become, whether they lead to increased bipartisanship, and in my case, hopefully that they stay around. So that's the timing that we're looking at right now. And then obviously when we get back in 2022, it begins again for FY23 with some of those lessons learned that I touched on earlier.
Thank you. And remember, if you'd like to submit a question, the email address is mikaelgood, mikael.good@aei.org, or tweet with the hashtag earmark reform AEI, all one word. It's kind of a fun question here. This one's for Anne. Could Popbox or somebody create an app or a website that's a little bit like the Domino's pizza tracker? That is to say, something that can help voters know the status of individual earmarks and whether they were approved.
Oh my goodness, I would love to. But yeah, so we've actually gotten this question before, and I love it because I think it really gets at the disconnect between what constituents expect from technology in the private sector and what constituents get from government in everything else. So, I mean, just a little bit of future visioning. You can imagine not only just the pizza tracker app, but what if we had a portal kind of with three faces? If we had a portal for constituents that could also be accessible from staff and also accessible from the committee. So requesters could put their request into the portal. It could be viewed by staff. You could interact with the requester within that portal to give feedback and seek clarification. From there, if staff could just hit a button that sends that request over to the committee, and then the committee hits yes or no, and then it immediately goes into that big, beautiful dashboard we talked about earlier, where constituents can play with the data. I mean, there are so many ways that we could use the technology here, not only to make this easier, but to make it more accessible and to really build trust in government that's missing, but that technology is really enabled in the private sector. So I love this question, and I am so excited about it.
Just a quick note to a previous question about where the GAO reports would be published. This is from Susan Irving. She says, all of our reports are published on our website, gao.gov. So that's where we can expect to find them. Another question here. This one's for Ariel. We talked about the fact that, we can't really judge bipartisanship within your delegation, but of course, there's working within. So the question is, did both the New Hampshire senators collaborate on all the community grant requests, or most of them, or only some of them? Can you sort of characterize how you may have worked together with your colleagues?
Sure. So for the entire delegation, obviously the House went before the Senate with their deadlines. And so it was actually to our benefit, and thanks a lot to my colleagues in the House, because that really sort of softened the ground and allowed for our constituents to sort of get initial flavor of the information that they would need to provide, so that when we came along, it was a little bit, I think, sort of easier for them to put together these requests. So as far as collaboration in the Senate, so Senator Shaheen's colleague, Senator Hassan, who represents New Hampshire in the Senate as well, announced early on that she would not be submitting congressionally directed spending requests. So while we did not collaborate with them on our CDS requests, there was existing collaborations on programmatic requests that benefit the state and the region that happened there. But for the congressionally directed spending requests in the Senate, all of that was funneled through our office, but definitely taking lessons learned from our colleagues in the House, and also, just getting a feel from them, several conversations about, this project or that, why they suggested the 10 that they landed on, and sort of just some questions that we had. They were so gracious and glad to help out. So lots of collaboration. If we do end up with a similar deadline, I'm sure it will be heightened even more so. If not, and if the deadlines are staggered, I'll continue to rely on my House colleagues doing the brunt of the work and then me coming in at the end.
Thanks, Ariel.
And Zach, if I could just add to, combine a couple of things that have just been mentioned, is that the fiscal year 22 process may not get resolved until, say, sometime in February. The OMB has put together their fiscal year 23 process. If it's a normal cycle, the president would likely be announcing his fiscal 23 budget request to Congress in, say, late January. So as member offices are thinking about or trying to, get their the fiscal year 22 process completed, they should also already be thinking about fiscal year 23 and trying to get information out to the communities and other nonprofits that may be interested. So that should likely start in January already, to be on top of it. And the types of resources that Ann helped put together could be very important to that process, even as that capacity begins to grow stronger on the Hill. But fiscal year 23 and 22 are happening on top of each other.
Yeah, Franz, you actually anticipated the next audience question, and I think you've kind of answered it, but I think as a process question, I think we could still discuss it. The question is, since the appropriation process is delayed, are we going to see a new round of these requests being made while the initial rounds still remain in the lurch?
This is hard to say when the Congress will complete the fiscal year 22 cycle. So it's hard to say, but I think if the president does submit the budget request, say at the end of January, the president's budget will be before Congress prior to fiscal year 22 being completed. Does that mean there would be a major gap between the completion of that? Maybe not, but what it will mean is that members will be quite busy, and especially the Appropriations Committee and leadership will be extremely busy during that time period.
Yeah, I can see that. We haven't really discussed this. I want to bring this into the discussion, and that's the sort of question of partisanship that was raised in our last panel, and the way in which this process of congressionally directed spending is perceived and how partisanship will shape its future. And so, Fran, since you've worked in Congress before and deeply in the appropriations process, from your perspective, sort of thinking back to your experience and then sort of thinking to the future of this, did you think that the Senate's GOP's lack of participation is something that, makes the process imperiled or endangered moving forward? Do you think that this has been a kind of, this has had too much of a partisan tinge to it and can't quite recover from it?
I think that's a little bit to be determined. When the Senate Republican Conference decided not to lift the ban, that may have scared off or had a few other Republican members who may have wanted to participate not do that. The majority of Senate Republicans that did participate were appropriations members, which then showed in the type of data that you presented earlier in a very skewed way towards appropriations members in both parties versus non-appropriators. Maybe there will be a way to show some of the benefits, but certainly there is a criticism currently that this was very beneficial to appropriations members. Now, one of the ways that this is a little bit different is that in the House, you represent essentially the same demographic population, and so the equal number of citizens of the United States. The Senate's very different. On one hand, there are several members on the committee who are representing very large states, and then there's at-large senators or senators for at-large states as well. So how will this play out? I think this first year needs to be completed to see, and then hopefully there will be some growing comfort in a bipartisan way to have more people participate. What was also interesting, though, is by the data you presented, that there was largely that sort of majority-minority split that has happened in previous years prior to the ban, where the majority party got 55, 60%, and the minority party got sort of the 45%. So I think the committee did try to pay attention to that, and as equitably as possible from that standpoint, try to provide as much to both Democrats and Republicans who made requests.
Thanks, Franz. Got a question here from Lorelei Kelly for Anne. She says that she loved your slides about initiatives that members took to share and curate this congressional initiative with their constituents on their websites. She would like to know, could you remark on any participatory activities that members undertook to gather input or ideas from constituents? She says that she sees the possibilities here, sort of like participatory budgeting, which is very well evolved representative activity in other democracies.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for the question, Lorelei. Let me just say, Lorelei was a huge mentor to me when I still worked in the House for understanding how can tech be brought to bear in a congressional setting. So thank you so much for that question, Lorelei. Yes, so we have heard, so like I mentioned, the closest example of this that I saw was somebody in Ariel's delegation was Representative Pappas, who did such a great job. And I think this was a first step, but this was a first step that was really exciting. As we said, so that office took all of the requests that came in and then made them all publicly available for constituent comment. We are hearing a little bit, I'm not sure what form this is going to take yet, but hearing that some offices are really interested in kind of building on that model and expanding their participatory input. Like we've kind of touched on a little bit, this is also a tech question. This is so if we have a portal to make it easier for folks to request earmarks, can we also use that portal to make it easier for constituents to participate in making that decision on earmarks if they're still limited on the House side, if there are limits imposed on the Senate side? I think Lorelei also kind of touches on something that I will be really curious to watch. I haven't heard of any offices specifically signaling that they're going to do this yet, but I think it's very possible, maybe even likely. I'm not sure if I'm going to go that far. But hearing offices kind of use that participatory approach to solicit priorities. Like I mentioned with Representative Simpson's example, I think it'll be interesting to see if offices do signal where they want to put their priorities in terms of which earmarks they're going to put up to the committee. It would be interesting to see offices open up an input process to the community. So where should I prioritize these earmark requests? It will be really interesting. I think it comes back to capacity too. So it comes back to tech capacity, it comes back to just staff hours in the day capacity. And both of those are limited quantities. So I think we'll see where offices kind of put the eggs that they have. So do we put them in constituent education and outreach to inform potential requestors? Do we put it into developing a really neat, transparent participatory project that engages in the decision-making and the vetting process? TBD. I wish I had a better answer, but I am really excited about offices working in this space, and we'll be definitely watching that over the next year.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Let's start or finish actually with some concluding remarks. Since this panel was really about looking to the future, why don't we all get out our crystal balls and think a little bit about how we would like to see this process assuming that it continues in 3 to 5 years, what would each of our panelists like to see this process? And you're welcome to talk about any aspect of it whatsoever, whether it be process related, whether it be outcome related, whether it be related to the institution itself. Where would you like to see earmarking in the future? And Franz, I'll start with you.
Thanks. I think it's a very important part of Congress. It's an Article 1 power that needs to be in place. There needs to be some strengthening of the process and the training. One of the things that would be very beneficial would be for members to be able to talk about it more, to be able to publicly advocate for these types of things. Obviously, this is still the first cycle, and they may not have done that as much, but for members who care about the institution, care about their communities, and see the value of it, to talk about it in a positive way, sort of to help counteract some of that negativity. That would be very, very powerful, much more so than any one think tank or outside group talking about it. This is just this event is just a small part of a description of trying to understand that. And then for that, and both on the appropriation side as well as on the authorizing side, to be a normalization of the process to enhance what previously existed, but also with the guidance and the sort of the direction and the elements that have been strengthened and added to the system this last time. So those are a few thoughts that would be necessary to have this continue in the future.
Thanks, friends. Anne, same question to you.
Yeah, sure. And I feel like I've been answering this question a little bit in pieces, but let me go back and kind of wrap up some of these into a coherent answer. So the biggest priority for me in looking at this is staff capacity. I think this was a huge lift for staff, and it's, like I said, it's amazing the work that staff were able to do to get this off the ground. I think if it continues to have this big of an impact on staff capacity and reduces staff capacity in other areas, I don't know if it's worth it. I think really making resources available to support staff to avoid duplicative work, to kind of share some of the resources that are created among these 535 offices, and keep each of those offices from doing this on their own. That'll be really important. And then thinking about going forward, like we talked about in the last question, I would love to see this really be an opportunity to bring new people into the process, to bring new people into a positive interaction with Congress, whether that's requestors who've never been thought that this would be a viable way to seek funding before. And it's like Ariel was talking about, to really kind of highlight some of those smaller projects that would fall under, kind of fly under the radar for other existing funding opportunities. Highlight those requesters, and then to bring constituents in to have input on that process. As Mr. Graves mentioned in the beginning, to really make these requests feel from the community, and to make sure the community as a whole has a buy-in, feels like they have a stake there. That's where I'd love to see the priorities go.
Thanks, Anne. And Ariel, last comments go to you.
Oh, well, thank you. So I think, Anne and Franz just really summarized it as to what I hope to see in the future with regards to congressionally directed spending requests. The normalization is definitely needed, and that will address an issue that Anne pointed out as far as staff capacity. Speaking as a manager of staff, when you know sort of the requirements that are expected in the next year and the upcoming years, it makes it easier to think about future staff planning and making sure that there are enough support for the members' initiatives to respond to those anticipated issues. So if earmarks are going to be a regular thing, we have the ability, when they are normalized, to sort of shift and adapt and make sure that, in addition to making sure this requests are submitted on time, doing some of the community outreach and technology advancements within how we solicit requests that we've discussed today. And the last thing I would note, and this goes to the sort of normality, and this is really on the appropriations process as a whole. I think earmarks were added again to the discussion to try and make our appropriations process more regular. Having constituents that rely on some of these federal programs, whenever Congress is under a continuing resolution, it's really the worst thing for long-term planning. And so in the future, with the help of earmarks, I hope to see a Congress be able to actually meet the deadlines that we have in statute, And hopefully that can become more regular when people feel that they have a little bit more skin in the game through these congressionally directed requests.
Well, Ariel, Fran, Anne, thank you so much. I've learned from this. I've actually, Anne, I'm kind of excited about thinking in terms of ways that constituents might be able to be involved in this process from the ground up. So it's been a really interesting panel. Thanks to all of you for taking the time. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us and for your really great questions. So with that, panel 2 ends, and I will hand the baton back to my colleague, Kevin Kosar, for some concluding remarks.
Hello again, Kevin Kosar of AEI, rejoining you. Thanks so much, Zach Corser, for that last panel and for your partnership in this event. Thank you, Franz. You've been instrumental too in helping me understand what's going on with the earmarking process as it's rolled out and putting together this program. The question posed by the title of this program was, what is the path forward for the community grants program? And I think that there's a pretty broad consensus that the program got off to a pretty good foot, particularly during a extraordinarily challenging year for Congress. You have all sorts of big things happening, January 6th and partisanship and all that. But more fundamentally, we have a baseline of a Congress that is overwhelmed, that's got so many things to do, and the staffers are so overburdened with stuff to do. And then we've created something new on top of it. So they really had to dig down deep and do their best to execute this. And they did, by all evidence, surprisingly well at it. But the question about the path forward, certainly there's a lot of ways that we heard today where the program can be improved, where it can be made less of a paperwork burden, where transparency can be improved, where data can be made that's more clean and usable, so as to ensure that the grant program is not being abused or going to things that are just not worth the public support. But the bigger questions seem to lie with politics. This program exists replacing something that was previously abolished in kind of a bipartisan political moment. And then it came back. And while both parties are using it, there's a definite asymmetry there. And there's always going to be electoral incentives to demonize any sort of program that involves spending. Never mind that it doesn't increase spending. It's easy to make the case that, oh, this shouldn't be done because it's spending. And that prompts the question politically, what's going to happen in the future as the battle for partisan control of the two chambers go forward? Could the community grants program end up on the chopping block? I think the evidence presented today indicates that that would be unfortunate. What we've seen is a whole lot of data to indicate that members from diverse areas across the country are taking money that's already been appropriated that would otherwise be spent by the executive branch and using their local knowledge to direct it to projects that they deem worthy and necessary after consultation with the community, taking that input. For a country in a populist moment, this sounds like a very good idea. One of the great populist critiques of Washington is that it's out of touch, that it's all about insider dealing and the public is being excluded. Well, the community grants program clearly was set up to be structured as a conversation from the people to their representatives, to inform them as to what the community actually needs. Whether is it more tools for criminal justice reform? Is it more repairs to roads? Is it expanding the wing of a hospital that's dealing with people with substance abuse issues? Is it water treatment plant improvements so that people had access to better water quality? Whatever it was, the community was speaking, Congress was listening, and thus we have this incredible diversity of requests. But the future is unclear. And no doubt AEI will have to convene people together in the future again and take a look and see what the status is and what the path forward will be. So let me close out this program with a lot of thanks. Thanks to all the folks in the audience who joined us today and provided us with a whole lot of great questions. I also want to thank the Honorable Tom Graves for delivering the keynote address. And I want to thank again my partners with the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Claremont McKenna College Policy Lab. This conference couldn't have happened without you. And of course, thank you to all the panelists who shared their knowledge and their expertise. You know, everybody who showed up today has spent an awful lot of time studying, crunching numbers, doing interviews, and all sorts of other things in order to understand what's happening and try to inform our conversation about this so that we could all be a little bit smarter about what's happening. As a matter of housekeeping, before I close, let me note that the video of this program is going to be up on AEI's YouTube channel. You can find it quite easily. Just Google AEI YouTube channel. We'll also email a link to the video to everyone who attended, and we encourage you to share it with others who are interested in congressional reform, budgeting, spending, and the community grants program. And with that, I want to wish you all a great day. Bye-bye.